ages of ages. Amen. Most gracious Lord, send your grace, your Holy Spirit upon us. Grant us intelligence, strength of soul. Illumine our minds and our hearts, that we may be attentive to the instructions and the teachings of your Holy Orthodox Church and the preservation of those truths in your saints, which we're about to receive as we go through today's lesson. May we grow to glorify you, our Creator, learning thy truths. May we be full of joy in learning these truths, and may be a shining beacon to our families and our friends, and that we may use this to serve the Church throughout our entire lives. Through the prayers of our Holy Fathers, Lord Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy upon us and save us. Amen. Christ is born. Let us glorify him. Thank you.
Amen. And well, let's begin. I start the recording, and this, as I said in the announcement, this section is going to be primarily focusing on the historical aspect of the Monophysite controversy. There's going to obviously be theology because that's the main part of it, but part 2 is going to be purely theological arguments, what both sides say in detail. This is going to be more of the basics, what both sides say on the surface level. And I want to kind of start with pre-introduction to the thing, because there's a lot of, I will say, incredibly problematic things that some people of both communions say. So the Orthodox Church today is a continuation of the Chalcedonian Christological tradition. We accept the 7 Ecumenical Councils. We can say 8, 9, and whatnot. Whereas the Oriental Orthodox, who are not in communion with us, these are the churches of Ethiopia. These are Syriac churches, Coptic churches, and Armenian churches. They are today considered as the Oriental Orthodox churches. They reject the Council of Chalcedon because in their mind it is a continuation of the Nestorian error. So instead of that, they accept the first 3 councils. And then in addition they accept the Second Council of Ephesus, which for us is a rejected robber council. This council was in 449. It's going to be one of the things that we're going to be talking today. And one of the issues that a big error that people make is that they think that this whole thing is just it's just a terminological issue. And they cite the documents such as the 1990 agreements between the two theologians, the two parties, where they basically agreed on some things and they decided to declare to everyone, hey, we agree on these things, maybe we should unite perhaps. That's kind of like the document. People will cite that document. People will cite intercommunion in the Middle East, and all of that stuff. And don't listen to them. The 1990 agreements, for instance, I've talked about this before. The 1990 agreements are just as worth as much as a toilet paper, to speak crudely, because first of all, it was not done on an ecclesial official level. On our side, we had people like Romanides who called Saint Leo a dog just to appease the Monophysites. So you already know that some people in that party are not people that we should be trusting. And I might, if I have time, I'll even post a statement where he called Saint Leo a pet on a leash, kind of just to show you the mindset that the people entering in that word. It's not as if they achieved communion. And most importantly, they agreed upon things that we already agreed upon 15 centuries ago, 14 centuries ago. So they agreed on things that we already knew we agreed with. So it was nothing new. And a lot of people make the mistake of, it's a terminological confusion. Now, a lot can be said, and we will say about that in part 2. I'll just say it in this way. First of all, the rejection of ecumenical councils and all of that stuff, the separation of the churches, if it's all due to terminological issues, then you're denying Pentecost. Pentecost is the event where the languages, the people of different nations and different languages are unified in one faith. If language can divide the faith, and just language alone can divide the faith, then Pentecost never happened. It's not true. And so it will go contrary to biblical belief. And I don't think that makes any sense. If you ask me, it doesn't make any sense. So it's a completely heterodox view. And I wanted to start by saying that. Another thing that I want to start saying is by clarifying some terms. Now, I'm not going to go over all of the terms. We will go over depending on the context, but people, especially Orientals, they have a massive problem with the term Monophysite. And the terms Monophysite and Diephysite are umbrella terms, okay? They are not, you don't just say, I am Miaphysite, and magically you're Miaphysite. No, these are umbrella terms. These are terms used to describe certain parties. Monophysite means Christologies that profess one nature, and Diephysite means Christologies that profess two natures. And within those groups, there are distinct Christological beliefs that go against, all of them go against each other as much as the other side, right? So for example, there's a Cyrillic Chalcedonian view, which is the dogmatic orthodox view of Christology that we have. One person in two natures that never changed. The natures are fully united without separation, whatnot. There's this view, and then there's the Nestorian view. The Nestorian view is also Diephysite, but that doesn't mean we're the same view, right? The two views are distinct. Just like with the Monophysites, there's Apollinarianism, which we will start with Apollinarianism. There is Severan Monophysitism, then there's Eutychianism. These are all Monophysite groups, but they're obviously different. They're not the same Christological groups. Now, in terms of whether they lead to that, that's another debate. That's a theological debate. But historically speaking, that's what they are meant. So when we call them Monophysite, understand that when I say the term Monophysite or Diephysite, I'm merely saying Monophysite meaning one nature, Diephysite meaning two natures. It's an umbrella term. It's really nothing more. It's nothing less. So people have a very gross, very bad impression of what these terms mean, and I don't think it makes any sense. And I kind of want to start by describing the Christologies in those groups. So the Monophysite Christologies, you can group them as one of them is Eutychians, the Sanusias, those who believe Christ is a mixed nature. The Severan Monophysites, who believe Christ is one hypostasis out of two hypostases, one nature out of two natures. You can also say they're synonymous, and that is a composite nature, composite hypostasis. Apollinarianism, and of course you can go into more detail, but you get the idea. Apollinarianism is the belief that Christ is fully God, but not fully human, because the human nature lacks a rational soul, a rational mind, as well. And the divine logos, takes place of that rational mind in that scheme, right? So Christ is not fully human, so he's only one nature. He's only one complete nature and one incomplete nature. And Diephysite Christologies will be classified as Nestorians, the Christology that believes in an outward union of the two natures that are in conjunction. More will be talked about later. Cyrillic Chalcedonians, the orthodox position, one person in two natures. And the Origenists, who believe in two natures with their own two hypostases, and the natures are mixed, and the hypostases are also mixed that create a new third hypostasis. And yes, it's really stupid, but that's a position that existed up until the 6th century. So they weren't really fully prominent. They were prominent in the 6th century a little bit, which is why they were also condemned in the 5th Ecumenical Council. But it is a position that existed, is a Diephysite position that existed, that we should say. Another warning I want to give before I start with this lecture is that don't fall for quote mining. Quote mining is, especially in this debate, is the most evil thing you can fall for. It's the type of, I'm 100% serious. If you fall for quote mines, you might lose your soul. I'm 100% serious, because I will say both sides just completely utilize out of context quotes. They don't out of context quotes. They don't try to understand the holistic mindset of what we're talking about, and that should be fully avoided, right? And I see a lot with the Oriental apologists. All they do is they take quotes, they just hammer quotes, and they say, "Oh, Saint Cyril said one nature here, that means we are right." It doesn't work that way. You have to explain more in detail how that leads to your conclusion. You can't just leave me with a quote and wait for me to connect the dots. You kind of have to explain how the dots are connected, and if they make sense, then you're correct. If they don't make sense, which they don't, then there's a problem here, right? And I'm not saying that quotes are bad. I'm saying that the arguments I will be making, the arguments in this presentation, the information, it's not going to be dependent on quotations. Quotations are going to be used, but they're not going to be 100% dependent on quotations. A good example will be St. Gregory of Nyssa. If you read his anti-Apollinarian writings, and if you took those like writings out of context, he makes statements that will scandalize both us and Monophysites. So for example, he refers to the human nature as the man, not as a nature, but as the man, as if it's another subject. And then he later on says, and by the way, the natures are mixed. So if you read them on face value, you're going to think this guy's crazy. How is he a saint? But if you read it in context, he rejects those views, and he further elaborates what he means, and they are fully orthodox, and it is explained by future fathers, right? So we don't use the term mixture anymore, but it was a term that was used. Doesn't mean that we in its proper context and its proper understanding, right? So we don't get hung up on the words and on the terms. We get hung up on the concepts. The concepts, what is being meant, is very important. So I kind of wanted to start this presentation by making that very point, and let us now actually properly begin. And when we talk about the Monophysite controversy, a lot of people sometimes start with the Council of Chalcedon, right? This starts with Saint Cyril becoming patriarch. I think the most important person to start with is Apollinarius of Laodicea. Now, who is Apollinarius? Apollinarius was a bishop of Laodicea in English, in Syria. And he was a homoousian, he was an anti-Arian, he was one of the fervent defenders of Christ's consubstantiality with God the Father. And until he expressed his Christology, he was considered as a very trusted Orthodox person. Now, when he described his Christology, that is when problems start to occur. He was not Orthodox at all. And as I mentioned before, Apollinarius' main Christological point was that Christ was fully God, but he was not fully man. And he has multiple different reasons. He was not fully man. His human nature had an animal soul. His human nature had a body, but his human nature lacked a rational soul, or you can call it a mind, in his view. And he says this mind was replaced with the person, with God the Word, essentially. So God the Word takes place of the human mind in Christ's human nature, basically, in his view. And he the reason why I'm mentioning Apollinarius is that this debate, and this is Apollinarius' frame, is that for him, this debate was really a debate between whether Christ can be said to be one nature or whether he can be said to be two natures. So I believe I have the screenshot here. I want to say, I don't think so, but if you read the anti-Apollinarian text from Catholic University Press, I believe, of Saint Gregory of Nyssa, in the introduction, it is pointed out that Apollinarius characterized Saint Gregory of Nyssa's position as a proto-Nestorian view. He said, according to Gregory of Nyssa, there is an assumed man, and then there's God the Word, as if there are two persons. So before these Monophysite arguments came up in the 5th century, they already existed in the person of Apollinarius. He already made those arguments, and a very important character that I want to introduce you, that is later on, was a disciple of Apollinarius. He was called Timothy, and I will be posting the image with the description here, and I'll also read. So give me a second. I have it here. Also, my internet's a bit slow, so it kind of takes some time for me to upload it here. But this screenshot, you can check this on Monophysite Lecture Notes channel. It's in the voice category. So if you check that out, you will see the image. Timothy, who is a disciple of Apollinarius, in his church history, says that this debate is essentially about one versus two natures. And I will quote what Leontius of Jerusalem in his Against the Monophysite says here. Certain Timothy, a disciple of Apollinarius, affirms in his church history that these things were said by Apollinarius in the sense intended by you. And so does his companion Polemon, whom both the Father Cyril and the patricidal Severus mention. Here's what he says. Those who say that the same Christ is both God and man aren't ashamed of confessing one incarnate nature of God the Word as being some sort of compound Christ. That is to say, if the same Christ is complete God and complete man, then he is two natures, just what the Cappadocian's innovation introduces. So Apollinarius says the two nature is a Cappadocian innovation. as to the opinion of Theodore and Athanasius and the vanity of the Italians. They pretend that they really belong to our party and that they hold the opinions of our Holy Father Apollinarius, but they proclaim just what the Gregories proclaimed, as St. Gregory the Theologian, St. Gregory of Nyssa, the duality of natures. And after a bit, he says, why do they pretend they want to become disciples of the, I'm not even going to say this, Apollinarius, of the cursed Apollinarius, I'll say. All by himself, he produced for us this formula with the aim of destroying the duality of natures. The formula is the one incarnate nature formula, right? Having somehow openly written as follows, we confess that he is both Son of God and God in spirit, but the Son of Man in flesh. We do not confess that the one Son is two natures, one that is to be worshipped and another that is not to be worshipped, but one incarnate nature of God the Word, worshipped along with his flesh in one act of worship. So the citation of this is, you can find the real citation of it in Leedsman's Apollinarius von Laodicea. Unfortunately, the book is in German. So if you know German, you can buy the book and see the citation there. If you don't know the German, then you have to kind of trust me and numerous other scholars that trust this source. But this is what Timothy of Beirut, who's a disciple of Apollinarius, says. He understands that this is a one nature versus two natures debate. And this is way before St. Cyril. Here's another screenshot. I'm not going to read the entire screenshot, but here's another screenshot that I want to show you from St. Gregory of Nyssa's book. This is from the introduction, where he is accused of basically introducing the idea of two persons because he believes in two natures. So what is going on here is that the Cappadocian response to Apollinarius is that Christ is fully God and fully man. For Apollinarius, Christ cannot be fully man, because to be fully man and fully God will imply a hypostasis as well, right? So it's kind of like the nature cannot be said to be complete without its own hypostasis. So that's one of the objections Apollinarius had. And again, in the theological aspect of this lecture, we will explain why that is not the case. But the Cappadocians basically said, no, Christ has two full natures, and he is one person in two natures. St. Gregory of Nyssa, in his, as I said here, as I've written, in his response to Apollinarius, if quote mined out of context will be very scandalous. For instance, St. Gregory of Nyssa refers to the human nature as the man and divine nature as the God. Elsewhere, he says the natures in Christ are united so strongly that they are mixed. However, St. Gregory of Nyssa later clarifies this view and said that the two natures have a perichoresis, have a they co-inhere and interpenetrate one another in the one person. And this is why, for example, we can say that God ate, right? Or God was crucified on the cross. We can say these things because of this interpenetration and unity of the two natures. I believe in his epistle to Cledonius, St. Gregory the Theologian also says the same. But they again clarify that there is no loss of identity of the two natures. Having made that point, let's move on to one of the most important parts of this debate, which is again the one nature of God, the Word incarnate term. This is the miaphysis term. Again, you can also say it as one nature of God the Word enfleshed, right? Or you can say one incarnate nature of God the Word, one nature of God the Word enfleshed. Basically mean the same thing. This formula is associated with Saint Cyril of Alexandria, and this is the main formula, the main battle cry of the Monophysites in the 5th century, in the 6th century, and further on. But especially first of all, due to the scholarly study of the Byzantines in the 6th century and later on by people like Leedsman, we now know that the one incarnate nature formula statement is not from St. Cyril originally. St. Cyril does use this formula, and we will talk about what he means by that. St. Cyril does use the formula, but he does not use it in the way Apollinarius intended out of Psalm 1. And Apollinarius is the original kind of founder of this term. I've heard some people make claims that Origen or Clement of Alexandria also came up with this, which doesn't help the Monophysites because both of them are heretical. Origen is a heretic, and I think Clement of Alexandria is at least heretical. which is what Saint Photius says. So they're not a good source on that matter, if I were to say. But several Monophysites claim that the one nature of God the Word incarnate statement comes they claimed it came from people like Saint Julius, people like Saint Athanasius, people like Saint Gregory Thaumaturgus. These forgeries were quoted by numerous different people, and eventually we realized again in the 6th century and today that they are all written by Apollinarius. Apollinarius basically forged his own letters so that his beliefs can survive after his death, which explains to you what kind of a heretic he is, which is why one of the reasons this attitude is what made him condemned in the Second Council. His belief condemned in the Second Council. And this section, Father Florowski talks about, I'll be posting it in the lecture notes channel here. Father Florowski points out that there was a book, I believe we don't have this anymore if I understand correctly, but there's a book called Against the Frauds of the Apollinarians, which deals with the forgeries of Apollinarians, and this book was shown in the Monophysite and Chalcedonian dialogues of 533, I believe. Yes, between 531 and 533 there was dialogue between the non-Chalcedonians and Chalcedonians, and this was an argument that basically the formula you claim is patristic actually doesn't exist. It's not patristic. Apollinarius came up with it. You got duped. That's basically the point that they made, and there was no proper response to it. They couldn't really respond to it, and here's an example of the Apollinarian forgery that I want to show to you. At the time, this was thought to be from Saint Athanasius, whereas the person who really was Apollinarius, and this is called the Letter to Jovian. So it says here, we confessed, so this is Apollinarius, right? If we confess that he's both Son of God and God in spirit, but Son of Man in flesh, we don't confess that the one Son is two natures, one that's to be worshipped and another that's not to be worshipped, but one incarnate nature of God the Word, worshipped along with his flesh in one act of worship. And so this is an example of one of the forgeries. Again, I want to reiterate, this is important to note because this will help you understand why Miaphysis even became a thing in the first place, right? Why did Saint Cyril even use it in the first place? Well, it's because of these existing forgeries that was in the Egyptian conscience at the time. And another note I want to make, and we will talk about the Antiochians later, is the Antiochians, because Apollinarius was an Antiochian. Antiochians understood that this was from Apollinarius, and this will be relevant later on. So the next section I want to talk about, that's enough about Apollinarius. Let's talk about, before we move on to Saint Cyril of Alexandria, let's move on to two natures, right? We established that one nature is not a language that is used. It's a Apollinarian language. It's not a patristic language. But what about two natures? If you've seen the video of Daniel Kakish with Craig Trulley, this was either in Reason and Theology or this was in Craig's channel, one of those videos, Daniel Kakish paraphrases Severus of Antioch and says, "Show me a father who says Christ is in two natures." That's kind of Severus's challenge, right? Show me a father who says that Christ is in two natures. Well, I can show you. So let's go. Let's show you the church fathers that speak of Christ as being two natures. The first quote that I want to show to you is from Saint Gregory of Nyssa in book 5 against Eunomius. I'll be pasting it here. Let me post it here. Saint Gregory of Nyssa, book 5 against Eunomius. I'll just quote the relevant section. I'm not going to read the whole thing. He says, "It is not the human nature that raises up Lazarus, nor is it the power that cannot suffer that weeps for him when he lies in the grave. The tear proceeds from the man, the life from the true life. It is not the human nature that feeds the thousands, nor is it omnipotent might that hastens to the fig tree." Right? So he later on talks about what form is it that is buffeted in the passion, and what form is it that is glorified from everlasting. So St. Gregory of Nyssa is distinguishing the two natures after the union. Again, from St. Gregory of Nyssa, this is letter 32 from St. Gregory of Nyssa to the monk Philip. He says, Christ then, existing in two natures and truly made known in them. If you want the Greek, in Greek he says, Christos duo iparkon physion. If anyone can read the Greek, they can probably corroborate what is being said here, but he moves on. He has the person of his sonship as a single entity, yet bears in himself an unconfusable and indivisible distinction between the word and the ensouled flesh, through which the principle of the properties is preserved integrally. More, we have Saint Hilary of Poitiers, and I will be quoting again from here. This is not going to be a huge florilegium, just to give you some explicit Diophysite quotations. Do you see that thus are proclaimed his humanity and his divinity, that death is attributed to the man, and the quickening of the flesh to the God? Later on he says, see his divine nature in the power to raise again, and recognize in his death the dispensation of his manhood. And though either function is performed by its proper nature, yet remember that he who died and raised to life was one Christ Jesus. Sylvester of Rome, in his book Against the Jews, says, of the two natures united in him, one succumbs to injury, but the other is shown to be greater than any suffering. We will be talking about the Tome of Leo later on, but this is, I believe, a century before Saint Leo, right? And finally, not finally. Now, this is from Saint Melito of Sardis, from his on Pascha, and what I'm posting here is the French to Greek, Greek to French translation. He says, for he was born a son, and led as a lamb, and slaughtered as a sheep, and buried as a man, and rose from the dead as God, being God by his nature, and a man. And the Greek transcript on the left, what is said is Phusei theos onke anthropos. Phusei is used in the plural. If you translate it literally, like without the grammar rules, it says nature's God, being, and man. If you translate it properly, it could mean his natures being God and man, his natures being divine and man, essentially affirming two natures, Saint Melito of Sardis. And finally, Saint Cyril of Alexandria himself, in his Glaphyra on the Pentateuch, explicitly says Christ is in two natures. You can find this in Petrologia Graeca, volume 69, page 576b. He says, he orders two small living clean birds to be taken, so that you might understand from winged creatures the man from heaven, at once man and God, in two natures, inasmuch as he came to be in the separate definition that belongs to each. He who shone forth from God the Father was word in flesh from a woman. And in the Greek, this is from Petrologia, the next screenshot. The right side is the Greek screenshot. The underlined portion is istiomen physis, which means in two natures. I have asked people that speak the Greek, I've asked them, what does this mean? Just translate the whole thing and tell me what it means. And he says, this is saying that he's in two natures. So this is an explicit statement of in two natures. Hans van Loon, who wrote St. Cyril of Alexandria's Diophysite Christology, agrees that it means in two natures. And I've seen some Oriental responses against them. They're really bad responses. One of them uses the translation from Catholic University Press, which I have the book here. This is translated by Nicholas P. Lunn. They use that translation. The translation doesn't use the term into natures, and but what their argument hinges on basically says that they quote Saint Cyril saying, "Oh, later on he says he was made one, so you refuted," which is a bad argument, as you can see, because we don't deny that he's made one. Our argument is that he says he's in two natures, right? We don't have any problem saying Christ is made one, because he is one. He's one person. And you can even say his natures are one in terms of unity, and I will elaborate what that means later on, but that doesn't mean anything, right? That's not a good argument. There again, so Daniel Kalkish, paraphrasing Severus of Antioch, says, show me where Christ is in two natures in the Fathers. Here you go. Christ in two natures according to the fathers. And as I said, we could use more quotations. We don't need to. I just want to give an example of the normative patristic view of the two natures of Christ. And Glaphyra on the Pentateuch is written before Nestorius was patriarch. So this was one of St. Cyril's exegetical works. Now, let's move on before we move to St. Cyril of Alexandria. We have to make a small note with the Antiochians at the time. And I want to focus on the two important people of the Antiochian party, which are Diethelism of Tarsus and Theodoret of Mopsuestia. Now, the Antiochians, people call it the Antiochian school. I don't like the school terminology. I think the idea of theological schools inside a unified faith structure, I think that idea is Islamic. I think that's a Islamic, Roman Catholic kind of an idea. We don't have that kind of an idea as Orthodox. I would rather say it's an Antiochian view at the time regarding Christ. Theodoret of Mopsuestia and Diethelism of Tarsus, they were two really important people at the time in Antioch. They educated people like St. John Chrysostom. Now, St. John Chrysostom was not influenced by them in Christology, for example, because he did not make their mistakes, right? But they were pretty influential at their time. And they are known as in modern literature as the Proto-Nestorian school because their Christology is basically Nestorianism, right? In fact, Nestorius came from that school of thought, you can say. So what Nestorius was saying in the debates against Cyril of Alexandria is he's basically repeating the Antiochian view that existed in the 4th and the 5th century. So for Theodore and Diethelism, who basically at the time, Theodore especially was a mega Nestorian. Like, he will blatantly say Christ is two persons, and then he will say one person as if that protects him. But for them, the union of two natures in Christ is not a hypostatic union. It's a union of conjunction. It's a union and they will call it a prosopic union. You can say it's a prosopic union. You can say it's a union of conjunction rather than essential hypostatic union. What that means, a conjunction will look something like this. If you have two people and they decide to agree on a task, they unite their will, they work in conjunction together. That's an idea of what conjunction means. So you need two independent, separated subjects to have a unity of will, and that is basically the Nestorian view of the union of the two natures. And this was espoused by Theodore and Diethelism of Tarsus. They believed that you could separate the names of Christ in thought and also in reality, which is why Theodore of Mopsuestia was very scandalous at the end of his life, because he rejected the term Theotokos. Because for him, Theotokos will imply that the Virgin Mary gave birth to the divine nature, because the term Theo, the name Theo, refers to the divine nature, not the person. So they have a wrong order of doing theology. They prioritize essence over person in that regard, and that's kind of like what leads them to have that heretical view. And Theodore of Mopsuestia later on, after his death in the 5th Ecumenical Council, was anathematized and condemned. So for us, Theodore of Mopsuestia is basically not a good guy. He's a heretic. We don't like him, right? But it is important, again, to understand who he was, and he was a very important person for the Antiochians at the time, at the time of St. Cyril of Alexandria, which is why St. Cyril tried to attack him after his death. Now, let's move on with one of the main characters in this dispute, St. Cyril of Alexandria himself. So, who is St. Cyril of Alexandria? St. Cyril of Alexandria was a bishop of Alexandria. He was, I believe, a nephew of the previous patriarch, who was named Theophilus of Alexandria, and he was basically part of like an ecclesial dynasty. He became a bishop in 412, and he was a bishop until his death in 444. So he was a bishop for 32 years, right? He's a very experienced bishop, very important saint in Orthodoxy, but also a very important saint for the Monophysites, for the Orientals, right? He's a very important person for them as well. So this is kind of like one of the big reasons why St. Cyril is very much debated often. Was he a Monophysite? Was he a Diephysite? What was he? And in their respect, in their mind, their Christology is based on Saint Cyril of Alexandria, which we will say no, and in our mind, our Christology is based on Saint Cyril of Alexandria, which they will say that's not true as well, right? Chalcedon, the fourth ecumenical, the third ecumenical council, the fourth ecumenical council, and the fifth ecumenical councils, they're all based on Cyrillian theology, you can say. So he was kind of like the main character of all of those three councils. Saint Cyril, early on in his life, was mainly a biblical exegete and an anti-Arian. He wrote polemics against Arians. He interpreted the scripture, made scriptural commentaries. Glaphyra on the Pentateuch is one of them, which I quoted. And many various different New Testament commentaries on the Gospel of John. Very important, very vital. He was educated in philosophies, and he knew both philosophical terminology and ecclesiastical terminology. So he was a very smart person. He's the kind of a person that you listen, very diplomatic. He knows what he's doing. Over time, he became very experienced in the Nestorian controversy. But people know him as a Christology person, and before Nestorius, his main deal was really the Trinity. So he was concerned more with triadology and biblical commentaries. And then Nestorius in 428 became the Patriarch of Constantinople. He was from Antioch. He was essentially a foreigner in Constantinople. And St. Cyril, after listening to what Nestorius had to say, he decided that he had to take some time researching the fathers, reading them, and basing his responses to Nestorius off of what the fathers say. But before we go into detail, because this is very important, we can't really understand what the debate was about before we understand what the terms meant and what the points were made, what the points that were being made were. And I want to show you a screenshot from Father John McCuckin's book on St. Cyril of Alexandria, the Christological controversy. At the time of St. Cyril of Alexandria, this is what the Christological terms that we use meant. So, for example, today, I'm going to use these terms in here today. Ousia means essence, the essence, substance, the being, right? It's synonymous with the term nature. But nature, right, it could mean essence, but at the same time, it could mean a concrete reality, a hypostasis, right? And then hypostasis will also mean basically the same thing, the underlying essence. So at some instances, these three terms will be synonymous. At some instances, they will be distinct. So for example, in the Nicene and the pre-Nicene period, sometimes the person of the Trinity will be described as one hypostasis in three ousiae, right? That's an example of the kind of terminological changes that were happening. The meaning is the same. It's just the terminology was flowing. It's just flowing and changing. But at this time, right, and prosopon, right, the observable character defining properties, the manifestation of a reality. So to simplify what we are talking about, I will take liberty at explaining, at kind of showcasing the real meaning of the important terms here. People think that, over time, as time goes by, you become more nuanced, right? That's kind of like the assumption that we have. It's Saint Cyril, it's like the opposite. He became more and more common. It's not because he lost his nuance. He was still very, very nuanced. It's just that in his expressions, he started to talk more like what his opponents will, like talk more like his opponents, kind of like speak in their language to kind of help them understand what he means. That was his concern. So, let's look at the terms physis and hypostasis. We know what they mean today. We have a good idea what they mean today. But at that time, in that context, what physis and hypostasis meant, and they were synonymous, they refer to an internal reality, right? It's kind of like not a manifestation, but a concrete internal reality of a thing. So, for example, no. And prosopon will, in contrast, will mean the external reality of a thing. It will mean a manifestation of a reality. So the reality is already there. It's a manifestation of it. And an example of this will, in Nestorian terms, will be person. And this will help us understand the significance of the term hypostatic union, for example, because when St. Cyril talks about union according to hypostasis or hypostatic union, what he says is there is an internal union in the person of Christ of the two natures, right? Whereas if you ask Nestorius the same thing, he will say a unity, a conjunction of the two natures. So in Nestorius's view, these natures are already external, they're already existent, but in their wills, in the wills of the natures, there is a unity on that level. Whereas for Saint Cyril of Alexandria, it's an internal unity. It's a real, concrete, substantial unity in the person of Christ. And once you understand what that means, it really helps you understand what St. Cyril of Alexandria was trying to say. Because if we read the 12 anathemas of St. Cyril of Alexandria, some of the terms we'll read will seem very foreign, very Nestorian sometimes, or very Monophysite sometimes. Sometimes even Monophysites themselves might look at it and say, oh, this is weird. Because of this, right? Because of this very understanding. He refers to them as reality. So the human reality, divine reality, they concurred and are composed in the person of Christ in his view. So this is why we will sometimes see Saint Cyril of Alexandria say there's two natures united in the one hypostasis, but at the same time, sometimes he will say there's two hypostases that are united. This is why. This explains why he uses those expressions, right? Nestorius, in turn, had a strict Diephysite Christology, meaning that the natures are united in conjunction, and the name that unites these natures is Christ. So, for example, the term God will refer to only the divine nature, and the term man will refer to the human nature only, right? But in both in mind and in reality, only the term Christ will refer to the unity of the two natures, which is why Nestorius said, we shall not say Theotokos, we shall say Christotokos, right? If you're trying to say that the one Christ in two natures was born from the Virgin Mary, Christotokos will be the most acceptable term to use, is what Nestorius. This is why he used this argument, because for him, if you say Theotokos, it will mean that it will imply that Christ's divine nature was being birthed by the Virgin Mary. And if you talk with Muslims, if you talk with Protestants, this is exactly what they think as well. In the Byzantine Orthodox mindset, this is not how we thought of it this way. And in our view, Saint Cyril will explain the doctrine of communicatio idiomatum. In English, it means the exchange of properties. This could also be explained by the mingling language of the Cappadocians, right? So Saint Gregory of Nyssa, Saint Gregory the Theologian. Because the two natures are distinct in their identity, but they still interpenetrate one another because they're united in the one person, we can attribute human sayings to the divine, which is why we say God died on the cross, which is why we can say God walked on water, God walked with us, which is why he was called Emmanuel, right? God with us, because God really was with us in his human nature, that is in unity with his divine nature. And for Nestorius, this is unacceptable. The names are separated, so you can't say that. So this helps you understand why this term was rejected by Nestorius. But it's also an important thing to note here that Nestorianism wasn't monolithic at the same time. At the time of Nestorius, it kind of was, but over time you start to have like differing views. So sometimes there are some Nestorians that will accept some form of communicatio idiomatum. They will accept some form of exchange of names and properties and whatnot, only still in a linguistic sense. So, for example, if you're talking with a Church of the East person and he says something, oh, we can accept Theotokos technically, for them it is only linguistic. Even in their theology, still, she never really gave birth to God. She just gave birth to a God-bearing man. Ultimately, that's still what is reflected in their theology. Now, let's talk about Nestorius a little bit. Nestorius was the Patriarch of Constantinople between 428 and 431. He was thrown out of the Orthodox Church at the Council of Ephesus. He was an inheritor of Antiochian Christology, but he was not really the brightest when it came to explaining it. So this is kind of an important point to make. He was not the best representation. Nestorius was an idiot. He was not the brightest tool in the shed. He was very undiplomatic. He was essentially a trad calf. Okay, Nestorius was a trad calf in spirit, in mind, because in a lot of instances he utilizes gotcha arguments, and he refuses to understand his opponent's position, and is never really willing to be flexible in his terminology. He focuses a lot on the terms, but not on what they mean. Which is why Saint Cyril had to basically condescend to his level, so that Nestorius might perhaps understand, but he still never understood what was going on, right? And Nestorius was not very liked when the Council of Ephesus was happening, and before the Council at Ephesus was about to happen, Nestorius had a couple of people that supported him, and this was in the Council of Ephesus. This is retold in the Council of Ephesus. And you can find this account in Father McGuckin's book on St. Cyril of Alexandria. His fellow allies, you can say at the time, came up to him and said, look, people come up to you, like there are people that say that you don't accept that God was born, or like God had a second birth, or not. Like, are you denying that Christ was a baby, that God was a baby? Like, are you denying all of these things? And Nestorius just like listened to the objections given to him, and he just basically gave an outburst saying, I can never accept the stupid idea that God was a 3-month-old baby, or 4-month-old baby, or 9-month-old baby. I can never accept a silly idea like that. And that's when his allies looked at him and said, yeah, this guy's crazy, and they left him. And they ended up supporting Saint Cyril of Alexandria in the Council of Ephesus. So Nestorius had a lot of opportunities to explain himself. He never managed to do that. But not on the topic of Ephesus. What happened at Ephesus, and this is kind of going to explain what happened later on. At Ephesus, there was a council that was decided to be on Ephesus in 431. Saint Cyril and his party arrived on time, and the Ephesian people celebrated them, partially because the Ephesian Christians had a very huge emphasis on the Virgin Mary, and they loved the Virgin Mary more than other people, very devotional people to the Virgin Mary, and that is why this was a favorable city for them. Now, if you want to talk, like, I'm not going to go into too much detail about how that move was maneuvered. It's all mentioned in Father McGuckin's book. And Nestorius arrived there at that time too. But Nestorius's trustable allies, which at that stage, even they were starting to feel like, even they were considering whether they should keep him or leave him. The Antiochians, right? Because he's a child of Antioch. He's from there. And the Antiochians were late to the council. The Antiochians took a lot of time. There was a lot of unfortunate events that happened that led to them coming late. And a lot of Cyrillian people started to think, are these people coming late like because they want to make us wait or something like that? So people were starting to get worried. They were starting to, is this a stalling tactic? Like, are you stalling us? And eventually, St. Cyril and John of Antioch, who was the patriarch of Antioch at the time, they correspond with one another. And St. Cyril, John of Antioch kind of says, if we are too late, you can start the council. He kind of implicitly says something of that occur, or something that could be interpreted to be meaning that. And St. Cyril said, okay, I'll wait until then. And he waited. The time passed. They were still not there. And he said, look, John of Antioch, he said that we can start the council. So let's go start the council. And a lot of different things happened. And he did some more genius political maneuvering to manage to start the council without the Antiochians. Some people might say, oh, this is abhorrent, this is terrible. The debates of this lecture is not going to be dealing with whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I like it. I think it's supposed to happen considering what was happening at the time. I mean, the bishops were dying, right? They couldn't supply food for a pretty long time. They were staying there for a pretty long time, just doing nothing but staying in Ephesus. So that's something to consider. but yeah, and the council happened. St. Cyril rubber stamped his Christology. He got the 12 anathemas against Nestorius. He managed to get his letters against Nestorius not anathematized, dogmatized, and everything went smoothly in the council. And then the Antiochians arrived after the council is ended. And you can guess that they were not happy with it. So the Antiochians make a counter council. They anathematize St. Cyril, and they basically reinstate Nestorius, and they basically say, nah, screw this council, we don't accept it. And so there's a dispute at the time between those two councils and whether they will be accepted. This dispute lasts for 2 years. The schism, rather, between Antioch and Alexandria lasts for 2 years. And an important note for a lot of people that are new to Orthodoxy, at this time of the schism, the rest of the Orthodox world was in communion with both Antioch and Alexandria. So Rome was in communion with both, other sees were in communion with both. So this is something that happened in history. And this lasted for 2 years. In 433, St. Cyril and John of Antioch come in agreement and they reestablish communion. And this reestablishment of communion was done with a letter called Latenter Coeli. This is, I believe, St. Cyril's, I'm speaking off memory here, but either letter 39 or 44. But it's titled Let the Heavens Arise, I believe. But this is his letter to John of Antioch, where he basically announces the reestablishment of communion. And this letter is very significant because I believe, in my analysis, with the way I'm seeing these things, this started a new wave. This is kind of like what kick-started the Monophysite revolution, you can say. And this part of the letter in particular is very, very important. I will be posting in the Monophysite lecture notes channel here. He says to John of Antioch, "We confess therefore, O Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God and perfect man, of a reasonable soul and flesh consisting, begotten before the ages of the Father according to his divinity, and in the last days for us and for our salvation of Mary the Virgin according to his humanity, of the same substance with his Father according to his divinity, and of the same substance with us according to his humanity. For there became a union of two natures, wherefore we confess one Christ, one Son, one Lord. According to this understanding of this unmixed union, we confess the Holy Virgin to be Mother of God, because God the Word was incarnate and became man, and from this conception he united the temple taken from her with himself. For we know that theologians make some things of the evangelical," and this is the critical part, "we know that theologians make some things of the evangelical and apostolic teaching about the Lord common as pertaining to the one person, and other things they divide as to the two natures, and attribute the worthy ones to God on account of the divinity of Christ, and the lowly ones on account of his humanity." So, as you can see from the critical section, he completely accepts distinguishing and speaking of two natures in Christ after the union, right? And this did not make the Egyptians happy. This made Antiochians very happy because they said, oh, okay, so this is not the main point of contention that we have. But for the Egyptians, this was a huge problem. And let me explain to you why. Remember the Apollinarian forgeries. The Apollinarian forgeries were existing at that time as well, and right, and people in Egypt taught that saints like Saint Pope Julius, Saint Gregory Thaumaturgus, Saint Athanasius, they believed these saints professed a one nature Christology. And then they look at Nestorians, and they saw Nestorius proclaim two natures, and they taught at that time, wait a second, our fathers say one nature, this heretic says two natures, so this whole problem is about whether there's one nature or two natures. So at that time, they came to the supposedly genius conclusion that this is what the debate is really about. And when they saw Saint Cyril blatantly accepting the usage of two natures, they thought Saint Cyril basically abandoned them. They thought, you abandoned us, you know, what are you doing? And they protested him a little bit. And this is why there's a lot of letters written after the Formula for Union where he kind of responds to people and explains himself why he accepted the formula for union, and used Monophysite terminology later on. He started to use it way more after 433, in a way to kind of prove that, look, guys, I didn't betray you guys. We're still, we're still good, right? Now, one thing I want to mention is that these kinds of expressions from Saint Cyril are nothing new. So, for example, Oratio ad Augusta, I believe this is the oration to either to the daughters of the emperor or the emperor himself. He says, often with regard to one person, the appearance of our speech introduces two persons. So what he means by that, let me explain very shortly what I mean by that. I mentioned this in the debate against the Monophysite. What this means is that although there is one ontological person, one concrete real person, you can speak of two grammatical persons. Now, a grammatical person just means a person in speech. This can mean an ontological person. All ontological persons are grammatical persons, but not all grammatical persons are ontological persons. So, let me give you an example. If I said, my soul thirsts for heavenly water to drink, what I've just done now is I've treated my soul as a grammatical person. I basically attributed personhood to my soul in speech, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I attribute personhood to my soul. For all we know, and we know this, I don't consider the soul as a person because the soul is not a person. But grammatically speaking, you can attribute natures as person in a grammatical manner. And what Saint Cyril is talking about here is that because Christ has two natures, or speech, at times it's as if we speak of two persons when we're not really speaking of two persons at all. This is actually precisely what I'm fighting against, right? Another statement from Saint Cyril, he says in the 5 tomes against Nestorius, he says, and this is from book 3 of the books against Nestorius, he says, observe then the word born of God, magnificent as God in the highest glory and on the throne of the Godhead, and the same one executing the office of a priest as man, right? And kind of like dividing, you can say, distinguishing, not dividing, I don't like saying the term division, but distinguishing the names in concept, whereas the names really speak of the same person in reality. And this is, and I will finally show you the excerpt. This excerpt is from second letter to Nestorius. There you go. Again, this is all in the Monophysite Lecture Notes voice chat channel, and it will be shown in the stream, hopefully, in the recording. In the case at hand, both phrases, his divinity and the nature of the word, indicate the Son's divine individual nature. So this part is quoted from the letter. He says, we say that while the natures that have come together into a true unity are different, there is one Christ and Son out of both. Not as if the difference of the natures has been annulled because of the union, but divinity and humanity rather have made up for us one Lord and Christ and Son through the indescribable and ineffable concurrence into unity. Right? So the distinction, the difference of the natures have not been annulled. They still remain. What does this mean? This means that although the natures are united, they retain their identity. You can still speak of them as, ultimately, you can still speak of them as two, right? Because you're basically distinguishing the natures. I mean, there's the human nature, and this human nature is not the divine nature, and both of them exist in a unity. So there's two. Doesn't take a genius to figure that out. And as I said, my point was to make that the point that I was trying to make is that these expressions are nothing new. They're not new expressions. They are orthodox expressions that Saint Cyril himself used before 433. But again, this agreement was scandalous for his partisans, and because of the Apollinarian forgeries, they thought he abandoned him. And on the context of today's debate, and give me a second, I need to drink some water, because I've just been speaking too fast, too quick. But several Monophysite apologists will look at this and they will say, well, their arguments, they will either use Severus of Antioch's argument who says Saint Cyril just didn't mean it. He basically accepted it just to agree with them in word. He didn't actually really believe in it. That's literally Severus's argument. Some people will cite the post 433 letters of Saint Cyril of Alexandria. He says, okay, he says, oh, so if that's true, well, you can say that's true, but Saint Cyril at the same time also says one nature, and he says, don't divide the natures, right? They will use those quotes and say, so he didn't mean what he said. There are three responses that I want to make. First of all, what he says, his Monophysite statements and Diethelism statements are congruent with each other. This is exactly what the Fifth Ecumenical Council actually does, that they understand that they are congruent, that they make sense together. And I will explain why later on. Secondly, before 433, this is the argument Hans von Loon makes in his Cyril of Alexandria's Diephysite Christology. He points out that before 433, and there's an article on Ortho-Christian that mentions this, Ortho-Christian Miaphysis formula that I can link. Yes, I think this article also mentions this, but before 433, Saint Cyril used the term miaphysis only 3 times. He used this formula only 3 times. 2 of those times is when he's quoting the Apollinarian forgeries, and he's talking about something else. So I believe in one instance he's proving one worship, and another instance is about something else I don't remember fully, but it wasn't even about the miaphysis formula itself. Only in Contra Nestorium, I want to say book 2, one of the Contra Nestorium books, in one of the Contra Nestorium books, he uses the term one nature, and what he means by one nature is basically, he says, he uses the body-soul analogy, and this is very critical in understanding his understanding of the unity. For example, we say the human nature is one because we are united with a body and a soul, right? The body and soul are different, but in the union, they become one, and they become the human nature. So his point was basically the divine nature and the human nature, they are united, and they become one, and we call this the person of Christ. So that's kind of like the basic language that he used. That's why there's one nature. So nature in that sense, more accurately, will mean a thing, kind of like 2 things come together and there's one thing as a result. Now this is analogical language because we don't think, for example, Christ is that the word of God is merely a product of the union. That's the Nestorian view, but it kind of explains the unity and how it should be understood. Only once does he describe the unity in that sense, before 433. And after he gets pressured by his fellow Egyptians, he starts using miaphysis. And one of his motivations is basically, that, if the fathers say it, then I guess I'll say it too. But another motivation of his is basically, if I don't say it, these people are going to think that I betrayed them and they think I'm an antichrist or something. So that's kind of like it's one of the sad features of diplomacy. But the way he uses miaphysis, and I want to reiterate, is not heterodox. It is not heterodox. Okay, it is orthodox. And just because we consider those statements orthodox doesn't mean suddenly we accept the Christology of the severance. As I said, in part 2, I will talk about why they don't make sense together. But that doesn't mean. But as I mentioned in the point that I'm making, it doesn't mean that they. It doesn't mean that we believe in the same thing. Essentially, that's what I'm trying to say. And third point, Dioscorus essentially ignores the letter. He ignores the Diephysite statements of Saint Cyril. He acts like they never existed. So in that regard, he's different from Saint Cyril of Alexandria. So if he was comfortable, he will not have any problem with the other statements of Saint Cyril, but he essentially just kind of ignores the concessions, right? Father John Makakin describes Dioscorus, who succeeds Saint Cyril of Alexandria and who is a saint for the Monophysites and is schismatic for us, and for some heretic as well. Uh, Father John McCucken describes him as someone who's Cyrillian, but he basically doesn't accept his nuances. It kind of in that way. So that's the problem with Dioscorus, who will later on succeed Saint Cyril of Alexandria after Saint Cyril dies in 444. And having mentioned that, let me see. Give me a breather, because it's very hard to. How many? It's been 1 hour, 5 minutes, so it's pretty difficult to talk about all of this stuff and not lose your breath. All right, so Nestorius, after Nestorius was condemned, Saint Cyril had other. I got pinged. A break maybe. Why not? Actually, why not? Yeah, we can take a break here. So we'll take a Q&A break here. You guys can ask your questions. I'll make sure this Q&A is like 10 minutes. You guys can ask your questions. I don't know if you can unmute yourselves in this channel, but if you cannot, you can type your questions in VC lecture, and this can be basic questions. Okay, don't be afraid, don't be shy. Like, this can be stupid questions too. I don't mind, because I acknowledge that I have a very difficult time explaining some things because I just forget them. It's very difficult for me. So if you can ask me any questions that you have in your mind, I will really appreciate it, and I would like to answer them to the best of my abilities. I'll be right back in 1 minute. I'll take, as Paul Williams say, a bathroom break. A comfort break, sorry. I'll take a comfort break, and then I'll be right back in a minute. All right, I'm back. Let me make sure I'm not accidentally. Okay, I am back. I see some questions. Unless the Q&A is really good, I'll end the Q&A in 10 minutes and move on with the topic at hand. So, first question is from Max C. Is it correct to say that Miaphysitism can be orthodox? It definitely is correct. If you look at the Fifth Ecumenical Council, and I will show you the anathemas of the Fifth Ecumenical Council. Give me a break, but the Fifth Ecumenical Council qualifies the Miaphysis statement and says, if you don't understand one incarnation of God, the Word, in this way, you are you're heretical, basically. That's what they're going at, and I believe. Oh, okay, this is anathemas against Origen. Give me. It's gonna take me some time to. Sure. Okay. So this is anathema 8. The 8th anathema of the Fifth Ecumenical Council says this in Monophysite lecture notes. I'll post this in VC lecture as well. if anyone uses the expression, I'll summarize it. Basically, it says you can have two interpretations. One of those interpretations is that the one nature refers to the divine nature, and one nature of God, the word enfleshed, means the human nature. So if you understand that as meaning two natures, then that is orthodox. Another understanding is that if you mean one incarnate nature by one incarnate hypostasis, which is the mainstream understanding of the one incarnate nature formula, that is also orthodox. So yes, miaphysis is orthodox. Strict miaphysitism of Severus of Antioch, which is the accepted dogmatic position of the Copts, the Syriacs, are not accepted. So we don't summarize. So like we can't really say the entire Christological system is dependent on this one term, right? The problem is when they elaborate their view of this, and when we elaborate our view, there's a difference. There is a distinction there. Could you post a passage from Saint Cyril about the energies interpenetrating the human nature? I know of some statements like that. I can't post them right now because it will take me way too long to look at them. And I remember saying not the energies, but the natures interpenetrate. Oh, energies interpenetrate. This you'll find those statements in Father John McCuckin's book on Saint Cyril of Alexandria's Christological controversy. He talks extensively about the energies, the divine energies interpenetrating the human nature, and how it's in turn in another way interprets our human nature, which is why we will defend uncreated grace, right? This is how we can understand uncreated grace. What do you think of Sam Shamoun's claim that Assyrian Church is not Nestorian? Is a complete, it's stupid. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Not only is Nestorius considered as a saint in the Church of the East, but so is Theodoret of Mopsuestia and Diethelism of Tarsus, who are also Nestorian teachers. And their Christology is completely at odds with the Orthodox. It's completely unacceptable. And although this is not about Nestorianism, I do have a video against Nestorian Christology. And as I said here, one of the problems is that the natures are united according to will. They're not united hypostatically. Another problem is that they are monothelites, right? So Nestorian position is a monothelite position. Philosophia asks, so Saint Cyril of Alexandria used certain terms such as miaphysis simply to appease his fellow Egyptians. That's one of the motivations. Yes, that's because before 433, he only used it he really only used it once. The two other times is when he was quoting from what he taught was the church fathers. And the only context he quotes it before 433 is in the context of human and divine natures uniting in a person. He's basically applying the body-soul analogy to the divine and human natures, which we accept. There's nothing wrong with that. The hypostasis of the Logos is incarnated, and he's the subject of the two natures. So my basic question is how does the Logos as hypostasis utilize aspects of the human nature if only he's the hypostasis? So we distinguish the natures and hypostasis in our view, but the natures don't exist outside of the hypostasis. They exist in the hypostasis. So although Christ did not change in the incarnation, he acquired new idiomata, he acquired new traits, he acquired new characteristics, because now he is fully human. He has become fully human, and his personhood manifests the two natures. So this is what is in a way what composite hypostasis is meant, right? The two natures are manifested in his divine personhood, and because the natures are composed, and he is the person of the two natures. An example of this is, for example, when we depict Christ in our icons, we can't circumscribe the divine nature, so we draw him in his human form, right? But just because we draw him in his human form does not mean that we separate the natures, because what we are drawing ultimately is the hypostasis. What is being depicted is not a human nature, it's a hypostasis. And the natures exist in the hypostasis. They're particularized in the hypostasis. This is what in hypostasis means. Bound to Warrior says, I came a bit late into the stream because I had other engagements, so if I could ask kindly as an inquirer, can you break down the main differences between Miaphysites and Monophysites, and which one is orthodox and why? That's a I'll say it's very one problem is that the unity of Christ is different. So we speak of hypostatic union. Both use hypostatic union as a term. We mean a union in the single hypostasis. For them, it's a union of two hypostases that make up a composite hypostasis. So there's a different understanding of a hypostatic union. There are monothelites. They believe that Christ only has one will, and the theological main differences are going to be explained. But I will say on a very basic level that we accept that Christ is in two natures as one person, and the natures are united in a unity where you can kind of speak of the natures as one in the sense of unity while they retain their identity, which means they are two, right? The Eastern Orthodox, us, we are Diophysites, we are correct. The Coptics, the Syriacs, they're Severan Miaphysites, Monophysites, they're incorrect. And I'll be posting the recording of the lecture on YouTube soon. So when it's recorded, you can watch it from the beginning because there's a lot of stuff that I talked about. Does Christ maintain the human nature after the resurrection? Yes, it's a glorified human nature. ASDF asks, I remember, Jeff asked the question of, does he maintain the human nature after resurrection? Yes, he is still a human. Christ is still a human being. ASDF asks, I remember reading that Nestorius was not a real Nestorian and that others surrounding him were. Is that true? That is absolutely not true. We can read from Nestorius that his Christology meant two persons. There's a problem that people have where they look at statements like Nestorius says, and he will say, Nestorius will also say two natures in one person. Like he regularly says that. In fact, Nestorius will say he denies that there are two persons. The problem is not what you claim to believe. And essentially, what the problem is this. All these Christologies, in a way, the Severan Monophysites, the Nestorians, and us, on paper, we say the same thing. We say there's one Christ, he's God, he's man. He's fully God, he's fully man, and he's one person. The problem is, does the system correspond to what you believe? The only system that corresponds to what the true faith is the Orthodox, is the Cyrillic Chalcedonian Christology. That is the argument. So they get hung up on what Nestorius says and take it at face value instead of looking at what his system descends into. Did St. Cyril affirm a union of self-subsistent and non-self-subsistent hypostasis? And if not, from whom did that originate? So the terminology of self-subsistent and non-self-subsistent hypostasis is not from St. Cyril of Alexandria, as much as the Monophysites will want you to believe. To my knowledge, from what I've read, I've never seen him use the term self-subsistent or something of that sort. Severus talks about this in detail in his view, where he talks about self-subsisting and non-self-subsisting hypostasis, and he introduces that kind of terminology and language. This kind of terminology and language is not in the way of Severus, is not in St. Cyril, it's not in the pre-Chalcedonian fathers, it's nowhere to be seen. However, you can speak of, like, for example, a subsisting nature, right? Like that kind of language is there, but it's not as if it's in the way of Severus, so to speak. So for St. Cyril, he will affirm a union of humanity and divinity, right? He will not introduce categories of self-subsistence, because another reason why is, like, it will not fit in the union of body and soul. Like, in the union of body and soul, like, neither are self-subsisting. The body is not self-subsisting. The soul is not self-subsisting. We will not say it's self-subsisting in that way, because if he said it's self-subsisting, it will mean that it's a person, but the soul is not a person. Another thing is that we will, for example, say that the human nature does not have a human hypostasis. The hypostasis of the human nature of Christ is the divine hypostasis. That's his hypostasis. So it exists in the divine hypostasis. That's what we will say, for example. You mentioned Jaja Jam asks, you mentioned a joint statement at the beginning between the Coptic Church and an Eastern Orthodox Church, I think. Is it binding on that Eastern Orthodox Church, Coptic Church? It's not. Why not? Because it's just not. It's not as if it was affirmed by a synod or a dogmatic council. It's not as if the entire Orthodox and the Monophysite bodies accepted that document. It's really kind of just two parties and the representatives of those parties like just coming together. It's nothing. It's just a dialogue, and there's nothing binding about that, I will say. Some people will claim it's binding. It is not binding. And even if it was quote unquote binding, then that doesn't mean we have to instantly follow it. I mean, Florence was binding, but we reject the Council of Florence, right? So in that same, like, it's nothing like the Florentian Council. So it really, as I said, it's as significant as a toilet paper. In fact, the toilet paper is probably better than it, because at least the toilet paper is not going to hurt you when you do the deed with it, right? Whereas this paper will. But again, like, I use a crude expression, but it's true. I mean, that's what it is. It's an unimportant paper. It is unimportant. And people focus on it too much. It's unimportant. We don't care about it. We don't follow like every single paper that like a couple of bishops or theologians point out. Like, we don't, like, Goark accepted DBH's social document paper. We don't accept that. We don't accept anything DBH says. We don't have to, right? There's a specific process in understanding what is dogma, what is accepted, and what is binding. And that process is explained in Chalcedon. That process explained by St. Augustine. That process is explained by St. Vincent of Lerins. And it is whether something is patristic, is antique, whether it is universal, and whether it has a consensus. That document, for example, let's say it was a synodical document. It's definitely not patristic, but aside from it not being patristic, it's not universal. It's not as if all of the churches believe in it. And yeah, it has consensus within its own party, but it doesn't have universality within the church. Not all, like for example, Athos straight up says no. So that alone should say no to universality, because there is nothing there. Mount Athos rejects this. Or Russia, I believe, said we need to talk more. So they reject this document too. So there is that. And finally, the final question from Mapolo. Zipper is writing, so I'll take Zipper's question and then I'll move on. Mapolo asks, a common objection from OOs I heard to Diethelism is that if Christ had a purely human will, then he will be only human. They say since he is always composite, therefore his will must be composite. What will be a good response to this? First of all, the presupposition that if he had a human will, he will be purely human. Well, if he had a human will, he will be fully human, but he will not be purely human. So that's a big problem. The second thing is they do not understand St. Maximus the Confessor's distinctions on will. So for example, the natural there's a distinction between the natural human will and the mode that human will is employed. So for example, it is what we call a gnomic will. This gnomic will is a feature of using the human will. It's not a part of the human will. It's not inherent into the human will. Gnomic will is a feature of a created human hypostasis, and it means deliberation, right? The deliberative will. Because we as humans, we deliberate between good and evil. Christ did not, for example, humanly deliberate between good and evil, but he had real, natural human inclinations. And the prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane is the greatest example of the two wills. Because in his human inclination, he was opposed to death, but in the same human inclination, following his divine, and he never at once opposed his divine will. In his same human inclination, he decided to take on his mission, right? So that is a completely stupid argument to say that if he had that's an Apollinarian argument. Apollinarius made that argument. And if you notice, all heretics are monothelites. Nestorians are monothelites because they believe in unity of wills. There has to be one will in their system. Apollinarius is monothelite because one mind, right? The monothelites of the 7th century, the non-Chalcedonians, they're all monothelites. The heretics are all monothelites. And the Orthodox are dietalized, so that should also tell you something. And also, to move on, to give you the final closing answer, will is a property of nature, of essence. So to have a human will, if you have a human essence, you have to have a human will. If you don't have a human will, you don't have a complete human nature. You don't have a complete human essence. So if Christ is in two complete essences or two complete natures, they mean the same thing in our language, but not for them. Well, in them as well, but in a different direction. If Christ has two essences, complete essences, then Christ has to have two complete wills. It's as simple as that. And if the will is composite, if the will is one and it is composite, then the essence is also composite. So it's a very stupid argument. It's a childish argument, and the Sixth Ecumenical Council and Saint Maximus already addresses this stupid argument. So, and we'll move on to more in detail in the second lecture, why they have this kind of silly view. All right. So, all right, let's move on with the section. So let's talk about Saint Cyril's death, right? What happened after his death? Oh no, before I move on with Theodoret, right? A brief word on Theodoret of Cyrus, because for Theodoret of Cyrus was an opponent of Saint Cyril. His anti-Cyrillian writings were condemned in the Fifth Council, but he as a person was not condemned. In fact, in the Russian Church, he's actually considered important. I believe Seraphim Rose calls him Blessed Theodoret. So for us, he's not heretical. He's actually, not we don't consider him as a bad person. But Theodoret did oppose St. Cyril of Alexandria very, very openly and did make many Nestorian arguments. And one of their arguments is essentially that, what about Theodoret? You guys didn't have any problems with Theodoret, and he opposed St. Cyril. So I want to make a little small word for Theodoret. And Theodoret of Cyrus was basically the best Antiochian theologian, and he was the Nestorius that Nestorius wanted to be. But what distinguishes Theodoret from other heretics is that Theodoret eventually actually did morph his position to be more in line with the church. Now, whether he personally repented and he was just trying to be subversive, or whether he really did repent and he just had like weird expressions, that is an issue of the heart. That is not an issue of an apologist. That's the first thing I want to say. That is an issue of the person and between the person and between God. It sounds like something I will never say, but it really is. I mean, to try to speculate what he really intended in persons like this, to me, is unacceptable. I can't accept that. You can have guesses, which we will have some guesses, but ultimately to say, oh, this means he never repented, we can't say that. And even the Monophysites have to accept this, because after St. Cyril's death, Theodoret was one of the first people not one of the first people, but one of the first people within the Antiochian party to call him a saint. So in his book Eranistus, which was written, I believe, in 447, where he is attacking Eutychianism, which we will describe that more in detail, but where he's attacking the Sanusians, the Eutychians, the Monophysites, right? Not St. Cyril. He considers St. Cyril a saint. He quotes St. Cyril against them. He defends St. Cyril's memory, and he makes arguments that he rejected beforehand. He uses St. Cyril's arguments that he rejected when he was dialoguing with him. And in my video on the defense of the Council of Chalcedon, I showcase various different ones. I'm not going to go too much in detail because I kind of want to get it over with, but if you want to see it, you can check that video out. You can go read Eranistus if you want to. But what distinguishes him from, for example, Arius, is that Arius never repented. Arius never morphed his views according to the church. He never accepted homoousios. So, for example, in Sozomen's Ecclesiastical History, he points out that Arius got back into the church in 335, I believe. In 335, he got back into the church, but in his confession, he did not express homoousios. So he still rejected homoousios, which is a cornerstone of our Trinitarian belief. And a year after, he died like he deserved to. But Apollinarius, for example, he never morphed his views according to the church. He never listened. He taught the church was heretical, and he tried to subvert the church. Theodoret, when the church anathematized the expressions that he used to express, he anathematized them. So that in a way explains why the Fifth Council anathematized Theodoret's anti-Cyrillian writings, because Theodoret, by his actions, implicitly anathematized his own old writings, even if he didn't express it. And they can find some letters and whatnot. But by his act, I'm talking about public actions, according to what people saw of him, this was the kind of movement that he was going for. So that's an important thing to consider before we talk about Chalcedon. And yeah, so and this shows you that Saint Cyril, after his death, was starting to have a real effect on the Christological debate at the time. In Egypt, in a way he did not want it to go. In Antioch, in a way he likes. And in Constantinople, which basically started to say, okay, look, we have to, this guy, this saint, we can learn a lot from him. And let's move to 448, the Home Synod of Constantinople. The Home Synod of Constantinople was done because of a monk called Eutychius. Eutychius was someone who believed the natures of Christ were mixed. He said that Christ is one mixed nature, and he said that the Christ is consubstantial with the Mother of God, but not consubstantial with other human beings. And he defended this view in the Home Synod of Constantinople in 448. The person presiding over it was Saint Flavian. Saint Flavian was presiding over that synod, and Eutychius was anathematized. Now, Dioscorus, at the time, the Patriarch of Alexandria, he looked at this and he taught, and there were two motivations behind what he is about to do next. One motivation is that, Constantinople is trying to be this big guy, right? Because there's kind of like this Constantinople kind of got its new jurisdictional superiority because of Constantinople I. Alexandria did not accept Constantinople I at that time, so they didn't really like the new rising status of Constantinople. And another thing, we know bishops they love their positions, right? So they kind of have this need to defend their own patriarchal sees. And another reason is he taught that Eutychius was someone worth defending. Now, funny enough, later on, he said Eutychius was not worth defending in Chalcedon. But at that time, he taught he was someone worth defending. I don't know why. Okay? I do not know why, but that's what he taught. And so he gets a council a year later in 449. This is called the Second Council of Ephesus. And he gets people like Theodoret of Cyrus, Ibas of Edessa, Eutychius, Saint Flavian, and this is a robber council because, first of all, there was a lot of violence going on in the council, and as Chalcedon proves in its first session, there was a lot of uncanonical things happening. So, for example, monks in Ephesus II were full participants. If you guys don't know, monks can never become full participants in councils. This is an innovation. Monks can be in councils, can be present in councils, can have some effect in councils, but monks can never become full voting members of councils. So there was an innovation in that regard. And another thing is he basically did not let Saint Flavian defend himself. He did not let Theodoret and Ibas defend themselves. He basically did what he wanted to. At least in the case of Saints like Ephesus I, Nestorius couldn't defend himself because Nestorius refused to defend himself, right? He refused to defend himself. He just said, no, I'm not going to defend myself. Screw you guys. I'm going home. But in this case, like, they were present and they were not allowed to defend themselves. And St. Flavian was martyred because of what happened in Ephesus II. Roman legates that came to the council shouted contradictur. And one very important thing, and this relates to Rome, is that the Tome of Leo was sent to Dioscorus. Dioscorus read the Tome of Leo, and he did not like it at all. He thought, this is trash. I will not take this seriously. He received the letter, he received the tome, but he never read it in the council. And in Chalcedon, he even said, I read it. And then turns out he never read it. So even in Chalcedon, he was lying about what he did. So he's a serial liar. He's a bad guy. That's what we get from Dioscorus. And if Orientals are watching this, they're going to get offended because I'm insulting their saints. I will, if they want me to apologize, I will apologize for not speaking harshly enough. So I'll leave it at that. But 449, this happens. Not nice stuff. And eventually, Saint Leo looks at this and say, look, there's some crazy things going on. We have to solve this. Like, people are getting confused. This Dioscorus guy caused a lot of problems. And another important thing I forgot to mention, Dioscorus excommunicated in Ephesus II two major patriarchs, Patriarch of Constantinople and Patriarch of Antioch. And Patriarch of Constantinople was superior to him, even at that time, because of Constantinople I giving superiority. Basically, Constantinople was second in honor. First was Rome, as always. But Constantinople, well, not as always, not now, but, but Constantinople was second in honor. And so there's that kind of like a diplomatic damage. And then later on, he excommunicated Rome, which was first in honor. So now wait a second. He excommunicates Domnus of Antioch, who was Patriarch of Antioch. I believe this was Domnus. He excommunicates Saint Flavian. He excommunicates Saint Leo. So not only is he like kind of pushing his own Christology, but he's also doing a very a very nonsensical move for a bishop to make. And that was another thing that people did not. Now, the excommunication of Saint Leo was a kind of like a response, because Saint Leo took his name from the diptych, right? He took his name from Diptycha, but the response was not just removing his name from Diptycha, just excommunication. Like, oh, you're not even a patriarch. Like, I don't even recognize you. You're not even a patriarch, which is, as you can see, it's way too far. So he's taking very extreme stances just to defend some dumbass monk. I'm sorry for using the word dumbass, but he's stupid. And the Christology of Ephesus II is essentially kind of rubber stamping one nature language that is out of two natures, and implicit or explicit rejection of two natures language is also another aspect of it. And before we move on to Chalcedon, we have to understand what the Christological debate at this stage has become. There were two Christological statements that were very popular, that was constantly used. One of them is in two natures, and the other was of two natures, or out of two natures. For the strict Monophysites, out of two natures was acceptable, in two natures was not acceptable. Whereas for the Constantinopolitans, the normative view, I will say, the Cyrillian normative view, was that both are acceptable because in some way or fashion both mean the same thing. So in and of, they mean different things, but at the same time their result is not distinct, if that makes sense. And this is the argument Saint Justinian makes in his Against on the Person of Christ. Saint Justinian makes this very argument that in and of are not really distinct. I believe Saint Basil the Great in On the Holy Spirit also makes this argument, but I'm not 100% sure. I think he kind of makes the same argument here, but that's kind of the state of the Christological debate that's going on. For people that say into natures, that, what we say, right? The human nature, divine nature. For out of two natures, proponents is out of the nature of divinity and humanity, there is one nature, one incarnate nature of God, the Word, that is enfleshed. So those are the two Christological positions that are in play at that moment. And at Chalcedon is trying to answer the question of Ephesus II. It is trying to, its purpose is to kind of reverse Ephesus II. It wants to reverse Ephesus II. And once everyone's done reversing Ephesus II, and what happened, the original plan was that, once we reverse Ephesus II, we can just go home and, we can do whatever we want. But because of necessity, there was a lot of different things happening that necessitated them to kind of go even a bit further and further. And this is where the tome of St. Leo was dogmatized. This is where the Confession of Chalcedon was announced. This is where the Council of Ephesus and Constantinople I was also dogmatized. Because at Ephesus I, Constantinople I was not recognized. It was recognized in Chalcedon. So the Fourth Ecumenical Council recognized the second at that time. So in a funny way, the Third Ecumenical Council was recognized before the second. Well, obviously both are just as ecumenical, right? And Theodoret and Ebas got back into the church, and I was kind of debating whether I should spend time. I'm not going to spend time explaining why Chalcedon is an Orthodox council too much. I'm going to give you basic ideas and their basic objections, but if you have questions, I can answer them. That's because I have a 1 hour video that deals with it. I'm sorry that I like referencing another video. I kind of want this to be a holistic thing, but extensively speaking, I already deal with this in another video. To give you the basics, let's start with the Tome of Saint Leo. The one of the questionable, the Tome of Leo was very severely criticized by the Orientals, and the reasoning behind the criticism is because of this statement from the Tome of Leo. Saint Leo says, "For each form does what is proper to it with the cooperation of the other, that is, the word performing what appertains to the foreword, and the flesh carrying out what appertains to the flesh. One of them sparkles with miracles, the other succumbs to injuries." So for the Orientals, this was very, very questionable. And then this statement was also a bit questionable for the Orientals. And you'll see the current Oriental apologists using these quotes. He asks, "What nature is on the cross? If therefore he receives the Christian faith and does not turn away his ears from the preaching of the gospel, let him see what was the nature that hung pierced with nails on the wooden cross, and when the side of the crucified was opened by the soldier's spear. Let him understand whence it was that blood and water flowed, that the church of God might be watered from the font and from the cup." So basically says the human nature was on the cross, not the divine nature. What he's basically saying it was that the death is proper to his humanity, which is what Saint Cyril also said. But for Orientals, they saw the each form does what is proper to with the cooperation of the other. They saw that and they thought the forms refer to two persons. Now, here's the problem. Here's a couple of problems with that. Father Ambrosius Giacalis, in his book on icons, explains the term form. He says the term form traditionally means essence and nature. So when we look at, I believe this is Philippians 2:5-11 in the new KJV translation. Yeah, in this is Philippians 2:5-11. I'm gonna post it here. This is what Saint Leo primarily has in mind, and I believe I accidentally. Okay, never mind. Philippians 2:5-11. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men. So what St. Leo was basically had in mind is basically the form was referring to the natures and essences. The second problem is that in Latin theology, form did mean essence, very explicitly. In Latin theology, form meant essence. We have to understand St. Leo's terminology as Latin terminology, and that's what he had in mind. And another thing is that when we read the rest of the tome, it becomes very, very clear what St. Leo was trying to say. So this is from the tome as well. Of Leo. Accordingly, he who, while remaining in the form of God, made man, was also made man in the form of a slave. For both natures retained their own proper character without loss, and as the form of God did not do away with the form of a slave, so the form of a slave did not impair the form of God. So again, and there's Saint Leo constantly used the term "one and the same Christ" to indicate that it's the same logos that is in human nature, that there's no change, that there's no other human person besides him, and which is what one and the same means. And when you read more of what the fathers, what they say, and how this tome is interpreted, we understand that it is orthodox, and that's how we understand it to be orthodox. And finally, Saint Leo, in his tome, also makes this statement. He says, "The divine Son of God, the impassible God, did not despise to become a suffering man, and deathless as he is, became nevertheless subject to the laws of death. So he's affirming the doctrine called theopaschism at this time. He's affirming that that Christ as God died, which affirms that he's one person, right? So just as the Virgin Mary is Theotokos, the person that died is God in his human nature, that is, not in his divine nature, but in his human nature, according to not in his human nature, but according to his human nature, the person of Christ died. So with all of these things considered, the Tome of Leo's objections seem like nothing, right? But nevertheless, these are the basis of Severus's arguments. For example, the Monophysite's arguments is that it implies two persons, which it doesn't. And Chalcedon also gives a confession, the Chalcedonian Confession, which speaks of one hypostasis or prosopon of Christ acknowledged in two natures. And if you've seen my videos, you know that the term acknowledged is a very critical point. It is describing how the natures are acknowledged. So for the Nestorians, the natures of Christ are distinguished in a concrete manner. To distinguish things in a concrete manner, there needs to be two concrete things, two distinct separate things to be concretized so you can distinguish them. So for example, me and my Pringles can over here, right? We're concretely distinct. We're concretely separated because there is the Pringles can and then there is me. But in the case of Christ, if we apply that, then there will mean that there's a divine word of God that is distinguished, and then there's a human word of God distinguished, because there needs to be two concrete things to distinguish, right? So this is the Nestorian view. For the Chalcedonians, this distinction is an acknowledged distinction, conceptually acknowledged distinction. You can call this conceptual distinction, although that has multiple meanings in modern philosophy. In Greek, it's called distinction kat epinoia. I like to call it distinction according to the mind. This is the term Saint Cyril of Alexandria uses it in one of his epistles. And what it means is that there's an actual distinction of the two natures. The two natures are truly distinct, but the way we understand to be distinct is not through the concretization, not through concrete means, not through the concrete means because there's one person, but rather we conceptually understand the two natures united in one person, existing in the form of the one person, and being distinguished in our minds, right? So we kind of understand that there is an actual true distinction going on. We just know it through our minds, not through empirical evidence, for example. So that's what conceptual distinction talks about, right? And Chalcedon is talking about that kind of a distinction, not a concrete distinction in its confession. And of course, later on, this conceptual distinction will have different meanings, right? So for the anti-Chalcedonians, conceptual distinction, they substituted with Thomas Aquinas' virtual distinction, basically. Just a distinction that exists only in the mind, but it doesn't exist in reality. That's kind of like what they say, right? And ultimately, finally, what I want to say about Chalcedon is actually two things. One of them is that the basis of Chalcedon is Saint Cyril of Alexandria, period. Chalcedon explicitly states that. It says that Leo is correct, right? Pope Leo is correct because he says what Saint Cyril says. So that's their basis of orthodoxy. Another basis of orthodoxy they have is that's the basis of orthodoxy that they have. So the Tome of Leo was even questioned at the council. They had a 5-day commission where they analyzed the tome, and they cross-checked it what Saint Cyril of Alexandria said. So the Council at Chalcedon, the orthodoxy of the Tome of Leo was dependent on Saint Cyril's writings. And this is a very huge point that Orientals don't grasp. And Roman Catholics don't grasp this either, so this is a direct refutation of papal supremacy. And I think I forgot one other thing, and another thing I wanted to mention is Ibas of Edessa and Theodoret of Cyrus. Ibas of Edessa, there was a letter claimed to be of him where he basically badmouthed Saint Cyril of Alexandria. Then there's a letter that kind of says Ibas is Orthodox. He's He's a good guy. So this letter of Ibas is a disputed letter. Craig Truglia has a really good article on the letter of Ibas, and if you want to read that, I will be linking it very soonly here. I'm just talking. All right, found the letter. I'll be posting it here as always, in the lecture notes voice chat. And there you go. This is a good review of the letter of Ibas. So that deals with it there. But his argument is basically Chalcedon did not think this was from Ibas, and Ibas kind of argued it was not from him. So Ibas basically says, I was not bad-mouthing Saint Cyril. But the Vedic Council seems like for Orientals, because he was accepted and because two people, just two people said, oh, we know Ibas is Orthodox because of his letter, which there's a question there. What letter is it referring to? Because there are two letters, right? There are two letters that is talking about Ibas. Which one is it? But they say, oh, there's because of the letter, we know him as Orthodox. So this could be referring to the letter that affirms Ibas' orthodoxy, or the one condemning him. And even if it was the one condemning him, them accepting doesn't mean it's dogmatic, right? Just because two people in the council said that doesn't mean the entire council spoke in a unified manner in that sense. So that's not a good argument either. And both Theodoret and Ibas rejected Nestorius and his system, and they were accepted on account of rejecting Nestorianism. And they will point out, Orientals will point out, well, but Nestorianism can mean other things too. So you can be Nestorian and say Theotokos, you can be Nestorian and say all of these things. That's the argument they will make, but in the public face of it, there's nothing really stopping them from coming back to the church, because the council, again, Chalcedon is about reversing Ephesus II. This is very important to remember. That's the reason they took those actions. It wasn't an independent council where they just said, okay, let's do what we want to do. No, it's about reversing a robber council, reversing the effects of a robber council. That's the primary purpose of the council at Chalcedon, and that's why it did the things it did. And if it's kept them anathematized even after they rejected Nestorianism, then they didn't fully reverse Ephesus II, which will be contradictory, right? So that explains the purpose, that explains the actions that they took at that council. And one final thing before I move on. If you look at the people who compiled the Chalcedonian Confession, the Chalcedonian Creed, if you look at the people who compiled the creed, you will notice something very interesting. The people who compiled the creed were all pro-Monophysite people. And I hope I can find it. If not, I'll spend time trying to look at it. I know it's in my notes, but I believe... Oh yeah, I actually found it. Great. I think I found it. There we go. I will be posting it in the lecture notes chat. And I'll be reading there's another also important aspect where the creed is constantly quoting a lot of stuff from Saint Cyril. Father McGuckin's book makes a great point that a lot of the things Chalcedon is quoting is directly from Saint Cyril of Alexandria. And what was the character of the membership of the committee? Apart from Anatolius and the Roman delegates, no fewer than 13 of the remaining 18 had supported Dioscorus at Ephesus II. So these people were people that used to support Dioscorus. So these people were not Nestorians. They were people who were like one nature people. These were people that believed in a one nature Christology. And what that might make you ask, well, if that's the case, why didn't they just affirm two formulas at once? And that's a good question. And I think maybe, obviously we don't know like the will of God, maybe it will cause more problems, perhaps. But a very good reason I can think of from the scratch is because Chalcedon is dealing with Ephesus II again. And what does Ephesus II do? It accepts Eutyches. And what is the problem at the time? The problem at the time is that a lot of people were expressing the views of Eutyches, where the two natures are mixed and it forms one mixed chimera type of Christic nature in Christ. And so Chalcedon thought, if we qualify our statement in a proper way, then we can kind of get away from this issue. So they understood one nature expressions are not enough to nullify Eutychianism. And that's why they took the direction that they took. And it even lists the people that were there. The list contains no known allies of Theodoret, no known allies of the Antiochians. Only one that is like Diophysite, really proper, is Eusebius of Dorylaeum. And he wasn't an ally of the Antiochians either. So all of the people who worked on the creed, and that is also very important, were Cyrillians. There were people whose concern was Cyrillianism number one. They thought St. Cyril's Christology was the number one important feature of Orthodox Christology. His expressions, so to say, at that time, they took him as the number one authority. So all of these combined, when you think all of this and you look at it, it's very obvious to see Chalcedon is Cyril, and Chalcedon bases his Christology on St. Cyril, and that I think cannot ever be denied. And more, again, I deal with the issues and the arguments in another video, but that kind of will be my summarized view, which took a lot of time to explain. I should have made it shorter. But now that Chalcedon is done, now that the council has been finished, we have to wait what happens afterwards, right? Dioscorus is deposed, he's sent away. We see the Trisagion hymn being sung, right? Holy God, holy mighty, holy immortal, have mercy on us. And this is the first recorded instance of the Trisagion hymn being sung. Dioscorus is thrown out. Chalcedon is done. Now we wait what happens afterwards. And what happens afterwards is a couple of no good nobodies in Egypt and whatnot slandered about the council, and they said, "Oh, Chalcedon accepted Nestorianism. Chalcedon just attacked Saint Cyril, condemned Saint Cyril, and accepted Nestorianism." So that's kind of like the first impression people had in Egypt, and yeah, that's obviously not a nice thing to happen, right? And Egypt had a very strong response against it, and Syria started to have a response against it, and over time there was anti-Chalcedonian activity. So now we have entered the period of the post-Chalcedonian period until the Fifth Ecumenical Council and what happened there. I will summarize what's going on here. I do plan one day making a video specifically on this issue, based on Patrick Gray's great book on the defense of Chalcedon in the East. So that video will come out eventually. But to summarize what happened, we had Dioscorus' anathemas against Chalcedon, which is what my video is based on. We have the Henoticon. Now, Henoticon is a document that was which's point was to unify the two sides. The Henoticon tried its best to not deal with the problems that divided them, but kind of just talk about the stuff that united them. So the Henoticon ignored Chalcedon, and it ignored the talk of the natures, right? It basically just anathematized Nestorianism, and it's stuff that both sides already agreed. And this is why I said the 1990 papers are worthless, because in the 5th century, people already knew what was going on. People already understood what they like. It's just a repetition of the Henoticon. In most regards, there's some things that are added, but in spirit, it's basically the Henoticon. It's no different. This starts a period between 484, I want to say, and 519, where the Anti-Chalcedonian East and the Chalcedonian East are trying to figure out like the status of the Council of Chalcedon. And the major patriarchates start to turn anti-Chalcedonian, and Rome understood the problem, and they said, "Okay, boys, it's either Chalcedon or it's nothing. Make your choice." And eventually, there was a formula of Pope Hormisdas, I believe, that kind of settled these things. And Constantinople and whatnot basically took on that position. They basically returned to Santa and said, wait a second, there's nothing wrong with Chalcedon. Why are we attacking it? And the fight between Chalcedonians and Anti-Chalcedonians further on. So there was an attempt at unity. It failed. The Henoticon did not work. And then we have the persons of Timothy Aelurus, who was an anti-Chalcedonian patriarch, and other people. The main figure is Severus of Antioch, and part 2 is going to be mainly focused on him. I have a 3-hour video, and half of that video is me refuting his idiocy. But Severus of Antioch comes to the fray, becomes the patriarch of Antioch. He gets exiled by Saint Justinian, I believe. I'm not 100% sure, but he gets exiled eventually, and he dies in exile. And he becomes the Thomas Aquinas of the Anti-Chalcedonians, really. He becomes their Thomas Aquinas. And it's also important to note the Chalcedonian position at the time and the Anti-Chalcedonian position. So Chalcedonians accepted Theopaschism at the time, but what happened was that there was a Theopaschite crisis. And what happened is that Peter the Fuller, who was an Anti-Chalcedonian, looked at the Trisagion hymn and basically altered it. And he basically said, Holy God, Holy Mighty, Holy Immortal, who was crucified for us. So here's the problem with that. And like his point, let me get, before I get to the problems, let me get to his point. His point was to basically say, okay, it was a litmus test. If you accept this, you accept that it was God that suffered on the cross. The problem with that litmus test is twofold. God called me divine nature. That's one of the interpretations. So, although Theopaschism normatively was accepted by Chalcedonians, that introduction kind of sparked division. And the main problem is that it altered the Trisagion hymn inherently, because the Trisagion hymn is not just about Christ. It is about Christ, but it's also about the Trinity. And like let's okay, and there's some Orientals that make arguments and say, no, that this was the original form of the Trisagion. He just returned to tradition. Chalcedon just innovated. Here's what I'm gonna say to this. Look, let's cut the. I'm gonna be crude. Let's cut the bullshit. It's a Trisagion hymn. Trisagion. Anything regarding three, it's gonna refer to the Trinity. Like, let's be honest. Okay, let's be honest. It doesn't take a genius to figure that out. It is about the Trinity, and to make it only about Christ is basically destroying the hymn, which is what Saint John of Damascus says. He destroyed the hymn. He destroyed the Trisagion hymn, and that's why he's heretical. And I got pinged here just in case I'm not accidentally muted or whatnot. Oh. All right. Moving on. So with Severus of Antioch, he becomes the Thomas Aquinas. We have a lot of different anti-Chalcedonian figures that are very prominent. Themistius comes to mind. Severus of Antioch. Philoxenus of Mabog, right? These people are coming to the fray, and they are basically detailing their rejection of Chalcedon and also detailing their view of Christology, which helps us because it helps us refute them, because the more they detail their heretical Christology, the more easier it becomes us to say, okay, this part is completely wrong, right? And if you go to the Saint Justinian period, this is the period of 533 and whatnot, the Christological situation has become, I will summarize the Christological position for both the Monophysites at the time and the Diophysites. So for the Monophysites, Eutychianism and Severan monophysitism was kind of like the two choices that you have to make at that time. And judging by the writings of Severus and the writings of people against the anti-Chalcedonians, the Eutychians had a very sizable presence. So Severus had to deal, like, just as much as he had to deal with the Chalcedonians, he also had to deal with the anti-Chalcedonians in his side. And so, for example, Sergius the Grammarian, who was an amateur, but that's a very good example because Sergius was a Eutychian. Sergius was a straight up Eutychian, and he asked Severus, look, what's wrong about anything I'm saying, right? Can you tell me what's wrong? And Severus is at pains explaining his position, and Sergius eventually kind of comes to that position. But the point that I'm making here again is that there was a sizable amount of Eutychians, like legitimate Eutychians in their party. So their party wasn't 100% orthodox. And later on, we see the person of Julian of Halicarnassus, whose heresy we know as Aftartodocetism, who rejects that in Christ that there are two properties. He says that there's only one property of Christ, and that there are no human properties, and that Christ is fully, completely incorruptible. So Christ did not really suffer; he did not really die, and that kind of a view, right? So Julianism started to become another Monophysite view that started to come up. So now there were three different Monophysite views at play here in their party. Now they had problems, right? And later on, by the way, the Julianists were called Gaianites later on, and there were several Gaianite patriarchs up until the 9th century. So Julianism in the Anti-Chalcedonian period was a very serious issue. So every time an Oriental tells you, oh, we Orientals, we had no problems, we have a clear Christology, just say Gaianites. Just say Gaianite. And if they know, they'll understand, oh, you're talking about those guys. Okay, yeah, they did exist, right? And if they don't know, you can basically tell them, hey, you had Julianists, you had Gaianite patriarchs and that was in your party, so you're not as clear as you claim you are. And this is mentioned, the Gaianites are mentioned, I believe, in Aloy Grillmeyer, who's a Roman Catholic cardinal's book on Christ in Christian tradition. I want to say this is volume 2, part 4. He talks about the history of the Gaianites and whatnot. So he talks about this issue much more extensively. For the Diophysites, until the Fifth Ecumenical Council, there were Origenists who believed that the two natures had their own two hypostases and both were mixed, and they produced a new tertium quid, a new Christ, meaning that Christ changed in the incarnation, endured the primary change. In fact, he changed as a person. And then you had Nestorianizers. Nestorianizers were, well, Nestorians, basically. The people that tried to say, oh, actually, Chalcedon is Nestorian. And their arguments were like, I forgot to mention one thing that I'll mention later on. And then there are Cyrillic Chalcedonians, which is the position the Fifth Ecumenical Council dogmatizes, which is the position that I will further explain in detail in the second part. But if you want a very good explication of the Cyrillic Chalcedonian position, look at the Confession of Saint Sophronius, look at the writings of, you can say, Leonidas of Jerusalem, look at the writings of Saint John of Damascus. They are all expressions of the Cyrillic Chalcedonian position and the Cyrillic Chalcedonian Christology. So that position, and people call this Neo-Chalcedonianism. This term was, first of all, it was invented by, I believe, a Roman Catholic. And this said Roman Catholic, his name was Charles Muller, I believe. There are multiple Roman Catholics that investigated this period, and they reject it. Like, they reject all Christology. For example, Charles Muller says the Cyrillic Chalcedonian Christology, Leontius of Jerusalem, for example, he was one of the defenders of Chalcedon before the Fifth Ecumenical Council in 520s or something like that. He said, we can't accept this Christology because according to this Christology, the implication will be uncreated grace. And he's a smart person. He knows, in his view, uncreated grace is heretical, right? And so he says, we can't accept this kind of a view. This will mean uncreated grace. And that's why he calls this Neo-Chalcedonianism. Don't use that term. It's a bad term. It's a silly term. Cyrillic Chalcedonianism is the most, I will say, accurate, academically even accurate term that a lot of our scholars use. And another thing I forgot to mention, Orientals will make this argument. They will say Nestorius accepted Chalcedon. And Nestorius did accept Chalcedon. He said, "Oh, I look at Chalcedon and I think this, this is good for me." Well, here's the problem. So did Arius accepted Nicaea. So is Nicaea Arian now? I mean, I made this argument against the Monophysite. Is Nicaea Arian now? The Nicene, in fact, it's even more than that, because the Nicene Church accepted Arius. Look, the Nicene Church accepted Arius. The Chalcedonian Church never accepted Nestorius. So, by that logic, the church was already in apostasy, according to that language, according to that argument. And Saint Cyril of Alexandria himself says, not everything that a heretic says is heretical. That's number 2. And number 3 is that, I mean, we had to kind of question Nestorius' motivations and why he accepted Chalcedon. Did he accept Chalcedon because he wanted to read it in his own way, or did he accept Chalcedon because, hey, look, guys, I'm a good boy now, get me back into the church, right? These are, I think, important questions to ask. And finally, we had the Fifth Ecumenical Council at the time of Saint Justinian. This Ecumenical Council is based on, first of all, again, Saint Cyril of Alexandria, but it's also based on Saint Justinian's Christology. It's based on Leontius of Jerusalem, and other Cyrillic Chalcedonian theologians. Saint Justinian's Christology, for example, he got this from talking with priests in Constantinople. So it was also the normative view of Constantinople, of Byzantine Christology at the time as well. And we see the anathematization of all Christological positions except for the Cyrillic Chalcedonian position. The Cyrillic Chalcedonian position is the accepted position. We see the anathematization of the Origenists, the anathema of Nestorians, the anathema of Eutychians, and the anathema of, you can say, Severan Monophysites. And it further explicates, it deals with the 3 chapters controversy. I forgot to mention that. The 3 chapters controversy is a controversy happened in our church, where we had certain people. The 3 chapters were, I believe, the 3 chapters, I believe initially they were from Saint Justinian, where he, in a local synod, whatnot, my memory fails me, but he anathematizes Theodoret of Mopsuestia. He anathematizes the writings of Theodoret, the anti-Cyrillian writings of Theodoret specifically, and he anathematizes the so-called letter of Ibas, the letter to Marie, right? The so-called letter of Ibas. Sorry. And many people, there were many people like in North Africa, and there was a schism over this too, so it was a serious issue, and people were questioning this kind of approach. They were saying we can't do this. If we do this, we're going against Chalcedon. So the concern for these people is that we will contradict Chalcedon by anathematizing Theodoret's writings, by anathematizing Theodore of Mopsuestia, and by anathematizing the letter to Marie, right? And there was a lot of scholarly debate on this issue. The side that won was ultimately Saint Justinian. Saint Justinian proved his point that these could be anathematized because Chalcedon never accepted these 3 things that he wants to anathematize. And because Chalcedon never accepted these 3 things, it means he can anathematize and get them over with. And that's what happened in the Fifth Ecumenical Council. Eventually, again, there was a North African schism over this. There was a lot of problems occurring, pretty much. But eventually, the Fifth Ecumenical Council pushed the Orthodox into one position. And I want to give a short statement on the Sixth Council, and then we can move on to the Q&A. I talk way too much, and people are starting to peter out. So we're going to get to the Q&A, and I'll do an announcement for the Q&A. And we can spend a lot of time for this Q&A, an hour, 2 hours, if you want to. I don't mind. Just a short word on what happened in the Sixth Council. There's a debate between Themistius and Theophilus of Alexandria, I believe. Not Theophilus, but the Patriarch of Alexandria at the time. And this debate was over whether Christ had one knowledge or two knowledge, or whether Christ had one mind or two minds. Themistius argued that Christ had two knowledges, and that it was a theandric knowledge, and that he had a theandric mind, whereas the Patriarch of Alexandria at that time said, no, he only has divine knowledge and a divine mind. And actually, don't quote me on the divine mind part. I'm not 100% certain. But what I'm very certain of is that this debate was on the will of Christ. And the non-Chalcedonian party dogmatized the view of Christ as having only one will. And the side that actually won is not the side that believed in a theandric will, but only in a divine will. The Alexandrian patriarch basically said Christ only has a divine will. So there was this dispute before the Monophysite controversy. And then we had the Monophysite controversy. Heraclius, it was an ecumenist at the time that tried to get the two sides together by using monothelitism as a tool. Saint Maximus and Saint Sophronius uses the Tome of Leo to defend the doctrine of two wills and two energies, because this is another aspect of the Tome of Leo. And Severus himself understood that the Tome of Leo is not just speaking of two natures, it's also speaking of two wills and two energies. And Severus even himself says, and Dioscorus, they both say, we anathematize the Tome of Leo not just because of the two natures, but also because it speaks of two operations, two energies. And Saint Sophronius says, look, according to the Tome of Leo, Christ has two wills. So this is an important feature of Chalcedon in the Sixth Ecumenical Council. And Saint Maximus debates with Monophysites and finds out that they are monothelites as well. And he kind of understands, okay, monothelitism really just came from these people in the current context. And as you guys know, monothelitism lost, diethelism won, and that will cover the overall historical controversies regarding the Monophysite controversy. There's a lot of stuff that I did not cover, because this stuff, like, you need to write a book or two to cover this stuff. Covering all of this, 2 hours is nothing to cover this stuff. But I hope I tried to help you guys understand what historically happened. I hope you guys took notes, and I hope when this video uploads, maybe some of you might watch it in full or whatever. And I hope you guys learned something from this. And now we will move on to the Q&A, and I will be making the announcement on the Q&A as well. But let me ping everyone. But this is the end of the Q&A, and I kind of wanna end this lecture with a prayer before we move on to the Q&A. Since Father Deacon Ananias is not here, I'll finish it with a hymn to the Theotokos. It is truly meet to bless you, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, and more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim. Without defilement, you gave birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify you. And let us begin with the Q&A. So if you have any questions about any part of the lecture, anything you want me to clarify, anything you want me to cover on this issue, this is your chance. And all right. Okay. But I want to ask, tell this to me in VC lecture. Can you guys unmute yourselves, or does this channel auto mute you? Just want to be sure. Okay. Okay. I'll change the settings. I'm not really good with settings, but I'll try to, I believe it's members. And okay. All right. I think you guys can unmute yourself now. So try that. Okay. Alex is here, because I do want to talk. Oh, Father Deacon. Oh, he's definitely here. Alex, good faith. Can you unmute, like, can you change the settings for this channel for now?
Check.
Yeah. For the lectures voice chat. I changed the permissions for. I'm just gonna change speak for everyone. Ah, I see now. I see. Okay, can you guys speak now? Try unmuting, if any of you. Dang. Okay. Good faith. Can you, while you're working on it, I'll just read the questions and.
I'm on mobile, so I can't right now.
Alex, is Alex here? I don't think he's here. Okay. Just tell one of the mods to help me out on it, but because it's way better to just talk because this is gonna be. Oh, Constantine is unmuted.
Hello,
Hello? Okay,
I'm here. I think they have to rejoin. I think it's still like the old settings, so unfortunately.
So if you want to speak, you gotta rejoin, try rejoining and
Yeah.
It worked for me. Yeah.
Okay, so that's the
It
thing.
works after rejoining.
Yeah, so and okay, so you guys can Bantu Warrior 99, the Monophysite lecture notes is gonna be here. They're always gonna be here. So you can check them. Oh, Bantu was not here. Okay, I'll mute Bantu. So Bantu Warrior, the lecture notes are always gonna be here, so you can go check them out anytime you want. I will even add things to the lecture notes even after the 2 lectures. So I'll actually kind of use it as an information bag while I have the opportunity. So okay, Max, yours was the first question, so you can ask it in public.
Okay. So basically, I don't know if that made too much sense in text, so it's good we have VC now.
Yes.
Basically, it seems that today, modernly, they kind of compromised their view because it seems to be the consensual view among the Orientals that our view or our Chalcedonian theology is orthodox. I don't think any hierarch from their church will say we are not orthodox because of that, which is not what they argued before. So they compromised on that. So my question is, when you look at that, is reunification possible from their end? Do they have to compromise more? I mean, probably yes, but can they do that reasonably? Because is it like as impossible as a reunification with the Roman Catholics or not really? So that was basically my question.
Okay, thank you. The first thing I want to say is in the mainstream, they definitely did compromise. They don't make a lot of the arguments they used to make, so they're not really fully faithful to their opposition. They're still very faithful to the mainstream arguments that they made. So, for example, even amongst the people who say we're Orthodox, they still reject Chalcedon and they make up nonsensical reasons, which I mean, that view should not even be respected in my opinion. I don't respect people who hold that view. I don't respect people with that kind of a view. And that's all I'm going to say on that regard. In regards to their compromisations, in an ecclesiastical level, I'm not really seeing it too much. I feel like they have, if you look at the books made by their bishops, they still kind of hold on to their position that our position is, if they don't say it's wrong, they say it's kind of wrong. So I will say a very modern argument, very modern apologetical argument, which was not in the 5th, 6th century, but it is now, is Chalcedon does not disable Nestorianism. So it basically says Chalcedon does not deal with Nestorianism well enough. So notice the old argument was that Chalcedon is Nestorian. Now the argument is it doesn't do good enough. The first question is that, well, first of all, the councils that are citing the previous councils, they don't have the requirement or need to deal with the issues of the previous councils. So there is that. The second part is it accepts Ephesus, and Ephesus deals with Nestorianism. So if just citing Ephesus 1 is not enough, then that means Ephesus 1 was not good enough with dealing with Nestorianism. So there's also that problem there. And I don't think they want to have that view, right? And so it's a strange argument. And Chalcedon does deal with Nestorianism. So as I said, the distinction of the two natures in the Nestorian view, that is impossible. Nestorians never will accept that kind of a distinction of the two natures. They will never accept a hypostatic distinction. And most importantly, they will never, ever accept St. Cyril's theology. They will never accept it. it spits on the face of the Nestorian view. And finally, is reunification possible due to their compromise? What needs to happen? I retain my position with Rome on this issue, as in like my position on whether we can reunite with Rome or not. I think for reunification to happen, they have to absolutely just become like us. So they have to not only accept Chalcedon, they have to say that our saints were actually heretics that are in hell right now. And as you can see, that's not an easy thing to do. It's very difficult to go from our saints are in heaven to our saints are in hell, right? We openly like anathematize Severus, for example. Severus is anathematized, I think, in the 6th Council.
So is Dioscorus.
I believe so. Yeah. So there is that issue. I think if they want to, I think the reunification can happen if they just become like us, if they deny their own saints and accept ours, if they completely accept our position wholesale. That's the only way we can reunite, and that's what they need to do. Ultimately speaking, that's what they need to do for us to reunite. And
Got it. Thank you.
If anyone wants, if you're muted and you want to ask a question, you just need to rejoin the chat. So this Mar Yosef, you can ask your question. Let me rejoin. Okay. Oh, it doesn't unmute you? Oh. Let me see. I feel like we just have to move voice channels at this stage, I think. If you can't ask questions in voice, you just type. Oh, push to talk needs to. I don't want that. Let me. Okay. Can you try to rejoin again? Yeah. I think I disabled that push to talk thing. Now you can use it without that. I did not know that was necessary.
All right, hello.
Hello.
All right. So Armalan, is it true that I've heard this a bit from I've heard this around when it comes to discussions regarding Chalcedon. So
Yes.
did the Oriental Orthodox fabricate the did they fabricate the words of Severus and falsely attribute things to him, or was everything they're saying, did Severus actually say the things that he said, etc.?
About Chalcedon, or are you wait, let me re-ask the question to see if I understand. Are you at like, are they saying that Severus's anti-Chalcedonian writings were fabricated and he never spoke against Chalcedon? Is that your question?
Yes.
Okay, I'll be completely honest. That's the stupidest argument I've ever heard in my life. I've never heard of that argument. That's not true. It's absolutely not true. If it was true, then first of all, people will notice. Okay, because the thing about forgeries is that eventually you get caught. Eventually you get caught when you forge writings and stuff like that. This is the example of Apollinarian forgeries. This happened with Apollinarian forgeries. This happened with the papal forgeries. A lot of papal forgeries got, they got found out. So unless there are like a group of saints in the Oriental Church that like push this forward and say, actually, he never spoke these things. I can't believe that, and I think we will know it today, especially if they were forged. So that doesn't make any sense to me. I'm hearing this for the first time in my life, actually. That's crazy.
Because the reason why I'm asking,
yeah,
the reason why I'm asking is because, one, I've heard this around a little bit by a few people, but second, the Varians, the Oriental Orthodox, were
you're cutting out.
or whatever were fabricating writings in their libraries and their.
You cut out for most of the statement. What did you say again?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
So I heard that because I've also heard that the Severians they were fabricating many different writings, and as a result, their libraries and scribal houses in Alexandria, etc., were could not be trusted or were labeled as essentially printing fabricated works, and that's true as well, right?
Yeah. I get the argument. You still cut out, but I get what you're saying. Okay. It's I don't believe whatever Severus said was fabricated. Could there be fabrications? I think that is possible. It's always possible. And another thing I want to mention is that one of the reasons why I don't believe it is that Severus was there in person in Constantinople, and Saint Justinian listened to what he said. So Saint Justinian was there when he spoke, and Saint Justinian kind of recorded the things that he said. That's kind of why I'm not too sure if On the Person of Christ was before the meetings in 530s or after, but if it's after, that will explain why Saint Justinian quotes a lot of things Severus says that can't be found in print, right? So that will be another thing. Like Saint Justinian will know that this guy's like that it doesn't make any sense. So there's that kind of a problem. But are there other forgeries? I mean, maybe it can be possible, but we have the testimonies of the church fathers that point out no, there is no the position of the Oriental dogmatic position is as we know. It's expressed by them, and we know it from our fathers as well. St. Maximus repeats what they say, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Because if I recall correctly, I remember that after Chalcedon, I'm not sure how long, but it was after Chalcedon that the Severians were once again accused of forging quotes from Saint Cyril and Dionysius the Areopagite.
Yeah, they used quotes from Saint Dionysius. The new theandric. Saint Dionysius says that in Christ there's a new theandric activity, and that's a quote that they use from Saint Dionysius. I won't say that's a. I will not say. Here's the reason why I won't say it's a forgery. If it was a forgery, they will try to make it sound as Monophysite as it possibly could. So Saint Dionysius just said there's a new theandric activity. There is an orthodox expression of it, like as Saint Maximus uses the orthodox expression of it. Whereas Severus, when in text 26 of Apollinarian collection, in his letter to John the Hegumen, he interprets that letter to say there is no duality of wills. So basically, there's no two wills. That's how Severus interprets that passage. If it was a forgery, and like what Severus wrote was a forgery, then they should have done a better job. They've done a very bad job at convincing people of their views. So I don't know. Maybe they are incompetent, but that's what I think. It seems like a purely academic claim. This though, I haven't seen anyone that is orthodox that made this claim.
I thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? If you're muted, you can.
I have another one actually.
Yes.
So I was thinking about Ephesus II, the robber council. So I really wonder how do they defend that? What is there? Is there an argument that could made possibly for that council? Because já vou sair. Here's the thing. Basically, Dioscorus was pretty much going crazy. He defended Eutyches.
Yes.
There was this thing with the violence involving Saint Flavian. So, what they will say is that I don't think they will go out and say it's an ecumenical council, but they will say it's a valid council. So, how do they justify that?
If you want to see how they justify that, I have a discussion. I want to say debate, but we use nice boy terms here. So I have a discussion on this with Daniel Kakish on this topic. We spent 1 hour. I'll link that to you. I'll still answer it, but I'll link that to you. That's the first thing I want to say. Second thing I want to say in regards to Ephesus II is their defense is very piss poor. Like, you explained why it was not accepted, and they basically say, "Oh, but it just happened like before Chalcedon," and it's like, if you like, here's the thing. I don't even think Daniel Kakish made any good arguments about Ephesus II. His position, he just kind of assumed it was true because it was a council and it had a couple of bishops, but that's not a good enough argument. There has been like councils, there has been robber councils, false councils that were rejected and by future councils. So this is not the first time this has happened, and it's definitely not the last time that it has happened. The Council of Hieria in 754 was an iconoclast council. The Seventh Ecumenical Council, just like it dealt with Ephesus II, does the same thing. So from their perspective, if I was them, I will make the best argument I will make is that I will make the argument that the Home Synod did not do a good enough job at letting Eutyches explain himself, which is false, but that's not an argument I will make if I was Oriental. It also responded to a real problem of Nestorianism that was still alive at that time. So it tried its best to respond to that, and that is why it dealt with the people the way it did in with Theodoret and other people. So that will be my response if I was Oriental Orthodox. But as you can see, it's not a good response at all. But
Yeah,
I think
it's
that's
kind
the
of
kind
weak.
of yeah. And also it was accepted by like they accept Ephesus II definitely. Like you can't reject Ephesus II and be Oriental. That would be very silly if they did that.
Oh yeah, and I think one of the main problems is that this council, I mean, there's a reason why it's a robber council. It really goes against the ecclesiological principles of previous approved councils.
Yes.
Like in terms of procedure, it's really
Yes.
messed up. Dioscorus is just going crazy, and it's not how it's supposed to be. So I think it's a really, really weak point for them to defend. So yeah, thank you, David.
Yes, and here is the link if you want to listen to this. I will admit I was not
Oh,
on
I'll give it a look.
I was not on top form in this discussion, but it was still good. Like I still covered a lot of the reasons why we can't accept Ephesus II. And as I said, I think the reasons are just bad. President-elect Colton, I explained it in the lecture, but if you want a quick version, uncanonical procedures, it resorted to violence. It allowed monks to be full participants, which has been never seen in in any council, not even ecumenical, but just in councils in general. It was an innovation. So in every regard, it was an innovative council, and it also caused division in the church, and the theology that it wants to push forward was a heretical theology, was a wrong theology, and the council was attacking an orthodox theology. All of these will explain why Ephesus II is a robber council, and also it tried to defend a heretic. It doesn't matter what happened; like they defended Eutyches, who was indefensible, and even after the council, he was rejected by the Orientals. That's how bad he was. They rejected the person, like they did that council for him. The council is accepted in their view, but the person that they made that council for is now anathema in their church. I mean, how stupid is that? Like, who's gonna believe something like that? I won't, and I don't think any sane person should. If you have any questions, you can type it in text. You can type it in voice. I was expecting a lot more questions, to be honest, but I believe voice still works, but
The lecture was so good, people have no thoughts at all.
I mean, I was expecting something, to be honest, but I don't know. Maybe no one understood anything, so they don't even know what to ask.
Oh, come on.
Nah. Oh, Maverick is asking a question. You can type questions in VC lecture, yeah. If there's questions in VC general, but there's none. So just type it in VC lecture. And while people are thinking about questions, I will so the second part is going to be tomorrow. It's going to be at 6 p.m. as well. I hope it isn't as long as this time. This one is going to be very heavily theological. So every theological question you have, you can ask there. We're going to elaborate there. That's going to be like the real meat of this lecture. The point of this was kind of just give you like the historical context and what happened and who said what, right? That's why I kind of quoted the fathers a little bit. And yeah, like as I said, I'm going to and at the same time after that lecture, I will be compiling a list of recommended books for you to read. I will be pinning that post in the Monophysite lecture notes channel. This Monophysite lecture notes channel is going to be part of like the academic category eventually, and it's going to be I plan to make it a living document eventually for people to see. And I will be making book recommendations, and within those recommendations, it will also explain like what that book covers, right? What that book specifically covers. But if you want to enter into this kind of debate, if you kind of want to understand like what's going on, the number one book I would recommend is reading Father John McGuckin's book on Saint Cyril of Alexandria and the Christological controversy. It does not deal with monophysitism, but it helps you get that background before you kind of get yourself into that debate, so to speak. Maverick Zero asks, what is the modern view of Evagrius Ponticus? Evagrius was condemned in the I believe 5th, 6th, and the 7th Ecumenical Councils because he was an Origenist. According to the Monophysites, Evagrius is a saint. If you don't believe me, you can look him up. And speaking of saints, Saint John Damascus is an Ethiopian saint. You can find him in the Ethiopian calendar, right? So they have that kind of weird thing too as well. But yeah, Evagrius is a saint for them. And I don't know what you mean by the modern view per se. But Saint John Damascus, yes, but Ethiopians consider him as a saint. I can find you the calendar. No Man No Cry asks, are there major differences between the various Oriental churches, Armenia versus Ethiopia versus Copts? Are there certain that are closer than others? Do the Armenians have the same view of Severus as the Copts? Yes, so there are differences between how they view these things. So for example, Copts, an example of this, Copts like iconography. Syriacs, they don't necessarily, right? So I went to a Syriac church in Sweden. I've seen this myself. There were icons, but the icons, you couldn't venerate them, so to speak. They were not within veneration distance, if that makes sense. There wasn't like an icon in a narthex or whatever that you could venerate. There was none of that. And that actually is an iconoclastic church, because several iconoclasts did accept icons in churches. It's just that they rejected how you should treat them. That's a different topic, but something that I wanted to mention. Armenia definitely has differing views. They have differing views, I believe, on the Eucharistic bread. I think some of them use leavened and some of them use unleavened, but I'm not too sure. Copts have canons on cousin marriage, so you can ask Copts. Copts will defend cousin marriage. Like they openly defend cousin marriage because it's in the canons. I've seen many Copts that say, oh yeah, cousin marriage is based. I've seen people that run away from a debate with me and just only write autistic toilet paper PDFs, say, oh, cousin marriage is a cultural thing, which marriage is a theological thing. So to say cousin marriage is purely cultural, it's a strange thing to say. And you will see very differing views, and some of these views are going to be like severe views, I think. That are borderline dogmatic. But in regards to like overall, nothing more comes to mind, to be honest with you. But you hear Roman Catholics constantly say, oh, which Orthodox, right? You have like different Orthodox churches and whatnot. But that argument really applies to Orientals, I think. That argument does apply to Orientals. It doesn't really apply to I won't say it applies to us. I think that will be inaccurate. But for them, it's it's definitely a feature of their Christology. I expected at least one Oriental to come and debate me, but as I said, they don't want to. They'd rather slander me in private private Instagram, Twitter group chat conversations, which is, I mean, fine, but like getting yourself in
Speak-
hell over something stupid like that is like, you don't like, that's such a lame thing to like. Imagine, it's so dumb. Like, there's no point doing that. At least like, I don't know.
David, about the Armenians, I think that they even historically had councils that adhered to Chalcedon. They had several reunification councils with us, including under St. Photios. And in our treatments of them, for example, Larcher, in his book, that is basically a handbook to dialoguing with heresies, he will put the Armenians on a separate category.
Yeah.
And so it's a bit different. And the Ethiopians, it's even more different. Like, they have a totally different canon of the Bible. There is probably one of the only churches that have a different canon of the Bible for the New Testament. And you will have practices that are sometimes closer to Judaism or shamanism.
Same with Armenians have animal sacrifice. But another thing I wanted to mention, I mean, they are pretty different, but I won't say they're different to the point where they're only in communion in name. Like, their bishops definitely recognize each other today. So don't make that argument. If you make that argument, it's not true. It's also important that we have to make correct arguments, right? We have to like be honest as well. That's gonna be what distinguishes us from them. Maverick asks, will you be debating any more Orientals? Yes, if they have a brain. First of all, I will not debate any Oriental that professes filioque. I will not debate any Oriental that denies essence energies distinction. I will not debate any Oriental that is a Freemason. But I will debate Orientals that actually do know what they're talking about. And in fact, I will even go as far as to say, and I did this with one of the covert leaders that they have. He said that if David is a nice guy, but he doesn't know what he's talking about. And if we were to debate, which really won't be a debate, it will be a lecture, he will need 2 other people to defend himself. So he says something like that, and I say, okay, bro, let's come debate. And what does he do? What does he do? He runs away, and then he runs away and gives this fake debate challenge. He's like, oh, come to my 10-person Discord server to debate me prior. No recording, but you can't do any of that. Look, like, which is like, give me a break, man. I mean, and then he says, oh, he wants me to he says diacord or nothing, which is like, it's not as if people are gonna come and like jump at his PC and punch him in the face or anything. It's not as if people are gonna like unmute themselves and call him an idiot. If they did that, it will make us look bad. Okay, so like, I'm just saying, look, if you really believe yourself, if you really think you know more than me, prove me wrong. But you can't. That's why you're running away. And finally, the final challenge I gave, he said, oh, he wants unfair conditions. I said, okay, look, here's all I want, and then you can do whatever you want. I want the debate to be about your Christology, because that's the one thing we haven't covered. That's what you want too. Let's debate, and you can have as many people as you want debating with you. You can choose any moderator you want, right? As long as I get to speak and I get to record and post this to my channel, I'm completely fine with any debate challenges that you're willing to give to me. I said that to him. Patriarch Prime himself related that information to him. And do you know what he did? He said, oh, okay, I'm not going to debate unless he apologizes. Apologize for what? Speaking the truth? That you change your position every 6 months? That you run away from debate? That you do all of these things? The screenshots that I sent to you where you admit you're an ecumenist, apologize for them? Or should I apologize for being polemical? Which is what church fathers do, number one. Number two, he started it. He said that I'm so stupid, I will need 2 people for him to give me a lesson. He basically called me an idiot. And that's what he started with. And all I said was truth. All I spoke was truth. And I said, if you want to debate, like, if you want to prove that, you can prove that. If you can't prove that, then that's an insult. So if anyone should really apologize, he should apologize to me, really, to be honest with you. But I don't really care about people like him. So even if he apologized, it will be good for him because God will smile and be happy with that kind of a humility, even if it's fake. But ultimately, I don't care because I want to debate. I want to crush his view. I want to prove orthodoxy is true. I want to convert people to orthodoxy. That's what I want to do. And if he doesn't want to debate, if he wants to take pot shots and make 500 PowerPoint slide presentations where no one will understand what's going on, he can do what he wants. But if he's not going to come debate, to me, anything he says is toilet paper. It's as simple as that. So yeah, I know this is wrong. Boniface says, just got here, so I don't know if you addressed this. Thoughts on the Orthodox Oriental agreement to join Christology? I explained it more in detail. It's worthless. It's basically, it's like the Henoticon. It's dealt with. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't change the church's position on anything. It's the only thing it does. It acknowledges what we already knew that we believed. It doesn't deal with the differences, and that is the main problem. And the differences, again, tomorrow we're going to be looking into those differences, and you're going to find out the differences are severe. Robin says, what's a good way of describing the normative authority which the church provides for interpreting scripture? What are some good papers, books on it? This can help me understand how to object to Oriental canons of scripture. I don't know. I don't know. I'm not the guy to ask questions about scriptural canon stuff. So don't ask me. I can't help you with that. Sorry. Nina asks, Orientals that profess filioque, is that really a thing? Yes, there is a Freemason ADS professing filioquist Oriental. Yeah. He's a catechumen. He's let me correct, ex-Freemason. But you look at the way he acts, and it's in. There's no way he's not he still acts like a Freemason. And yeah, he professes filioque and he wants to debate me. And I said, you are heterodox even in your own church. I'm not gonna legitimize you. I will not legitimize you because I believe in honesty. If I debated a filioquist Oriental, I don't think this will be honest with me because I will be legitimizing him as a legitimate Oriental. I don't want to legitimize people like that. Brock Lolly said, David, some guy popped in earlier to general to call you Antichrist. Yeah, that's cool. I don't really care. His name is Daniel Inia. Oh, he's an idiot. Whatever. There are Indian Orientals who are Protestant syncretists, so it doesn't. I think Indian Oriental, there are different Indian churches to my knowledge, and I think the mainstream, Indian church is the Church of the East. If I'm not wrong, I'm not too sure, but I'm pretty sure they're Nestorian, and they're not in communion with Oriental. So Malankara Lutheran Church. Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah, Indian Nestorians, Uniates, and Orientals. Yes, that's true. Malankara, there's a Uniate Malankara church for the Roman Catholics, but this is not about Roman Catholics, right?
I actually came up with another question.
Good. As I said, I don't mind questions. It can be basic questions. If I dealt with it in this lecture, I'm gonna give a short answer because I already dealt with it. But I'm fine with any questions. If you want clarifications, then that's good. What's your question?
Sure. So, and I think I have heard that in a video from Craig Bruglia in passing. But basically, he mentioned that the Ethiopians actually weren't really players during the polemics and controversies, and they really just got themselves dragged to this schism. They weren't really very active in the whole controversy. So have you ever read or heard something about that? Maybe that's a reason why they celebrate St. John Damascus. So what do you know about that?
So I definitely agree with that assessment. I think that's pretty true. The Ethiopian church has a history of its own. We have several Ethiopian saints, and back when we were in communion with Ethiopia, I think Saint Elespan is one of them, and Saint Caleb of Axum. I don't remember. Let me make sure when he lived, because there's Saint Caleb of Axum, who's an Ethiopian saint. There's, I believe, Saint Elespan, Oh no, they're the same. I'm stupid. I'm so stupid. Yeah, they're the same person. I can't believe I mixed them up. I just heard those two names and I thought, oh, they must be different people. No, so there's Saint Caleb of Axum, also known as Saint Elespan, is an Ethiopian saint of ours. So I think that like we have Ethiopian saints. He died in 540, so this means at that time we still consider Ethiopians as part of the church. So
Very interesting.
yeah.
Yeah.
Let me look at the John of Damascus, Ethiopian. I'm gonna find it. John of Damascus. Any more questions? How do they understand the essence energies distinction? That's a very good question. That's a very important question too, because I kind of made this mistake myself a little bit. And I've seen other people make this mistake. In the Oriental view, essence energies distinction is real. They do believe in the essence energies distinction. In many different writings of Cyrus of Antioch, he makes use of the distinction between energy and essence. In Sergius's, in his letter to Sergius, he distinguishes he makes the distinction, and he even distinguishes between like the periods of energy where like the agent, right, the person making that energy, the activity itself, and the kind of like a result of that energy. I don't remember the exact Greek or even English terms, but he talks about that. So he believes in the essence energies distinction, which is another reason why I'm not going to debate essence energy distinction denying Orientals, because it's obviously not true. Their position does uphold that distinction, so they do believe in it. Do you think Copts will ever accept Chalcedon? Well, if they accept Chalcedon, they will cease to be non-Chalcedonians. So they will accept Chalcedon if they repent and look into the council with a true heart, and they read it properly instead of trying to refute it, but read it properly. And at the end, they will, because even the enemies of Chalcedon, even they admit that it's not a bad council. But they have to admit that not being a bad council means it's a good council that they have to accept. And that they were the wrong people. And that it should have been accepted all along. If they don't accept that, then that's their problem. But that's the only way they can accept Chalcedon, really. It's just, they need to repent. I can do only so much to help them do that. It's something that they have to do themselves. And how will Miaphysitism differ on the incarnation, or does it not? It does differ, but this is one of the questions that I think it will really be answered it will really be answered tomorrow, really fully. As I said, what they want and what they get in their system are two different things. But some of the most basic distinctions and differences is their absolute rejection of any type of duality that is real. That is a very huge feature of their Christology, and as a result, their monothelitism and monoenergism is a consequence of that view. So their monothelitism is one of the basically like the main like basic points where we can pinpoint and say this is why you're wrong. And it will differ on the incarnation because it will make Christ's human will subservient to the divine will. Now we will say Christ humanely in a human manner obeys the will of the Father. We don't oppose that kind of a saying, but what we say, he freely does that. In their system, it's not freely done that. It's natural, therefore it's compelled. So that's kind of like so he is compelled to follow the divine will in their system, and it can be explained much more in detail, which I do explain more in detail, but this is a feature of their Christology, and this is one of the main things they will differ from on the incarnation, definitely. How do they deal with the Christology of the Cappadocian fathers when it's very much in line with Chalcedonian formula? Yeah, they really can't. And the person I debated before I debated him, he looked at Saint Ambrose and Saint Gregory of Nyssa speaking of two natures and two energies, and he completely failed to give a proper answer. Like, he could not give an answer. This is before, like, way before the debate, right? And he looks at Saint Gregory of Nyssa speaking of two energies, and he says, "Oh, this proves that there's one energy," which is like, like how much is your IQ, man? Like this, it's insane. Like the quote mining is one thing. This is even insane. This is like, I don't know. This is like quoting a church father saying filioque is false and then saying filioque is true. It's just as stupid as that. So I don't get it. But they will in terms of, like, on the surface they will say, "Oh, we're the church of the Cappadocians," and whatnot. But reality, they're not. They completely spit on the face of Cappadocian fathers, definitely, with what they preach. Let me find. So there is a trusted. I'll post this in lecture VC. Here's a Ethiopian church commemorates John of Damascus. This is December 17th. So he's in December 17th in the church calendar. He is commemorated as a saint. Which, if you read Saint John of Damascus, you will understand how stupid this is. This is like, to venerate the guy who says you're heretical is insane. Do they have a treatment against monothelitism? It seems Miaphysites have to deny Diethelism. Yes. It's the anti-Chalcedonian view. They straight up admit that the tome of Leo is dio-energist, and therefore it's diothelite. And and any argument they make against Chalcedon and against the idea of two natures, they make it on the basis of two energies and two wills as well, in some way or fashion. It seems Miaphysites have to deny Diethelism. They don't seem to. They have to, because Severus explicitly in numerous different passages rejects two wills. Like, he explicitly rejects two wills. If you watch my video on Severus, I showcase various different quotes, and I can find one of them right now. Like the text 26 of Apollinarius, he explicitly says, when we read St. Dionysius saying there's a new theandric activity, we read it understanding that it's a rejection of every duality. So that's what he says. And also the debate between Themistius and the Patriarch of Alexandria at that time. When you read the debates that are going on, it is a Miatellite versus Monotellite debate. It's kind of like Themistius is kind of but he's not really. He's not a Dietelite. But what he says is closer to us, and they deny even that because they think it's Nestorian. So, will you recommend to read On the Person of Christ by Saint Justinian first, or Against the Monophysites by Leontius of Jerusalem? I think either order is fine. I pretty much think either order is fine. Against the Monophysites will give you a very good idea of like the normative Byzantine position, and like what argument, like a lot of the stuff I say is a lot of the stuff he says as well. So that's a good read. And like the second part, he deals with numerous different logical, theological arguments. Saint Justinian kind of gives like an overview, and he kind of focuses on our own Christology. Leontius doesn't really do that. He focuses on their Christology, whereas Saint Justinian focuses on what we believe, and he explains our Christological view. So that's where they differ. So, if you want to know about our view first and then theirs in contrast, or like the defense of our views more so, because Leontius deals with defending our view, and he kind of argues against their view, whereas Saint Justinian kind of prioritizes our view and what we believe in our Christology. But yeah, as you can see in the voice chat lecture, Ethiopian Church Community of St. John of Damascus. If you look at, if you can find an Ethiopian calendar and look up December 17, you'll find John of Damascus' name here. In fact, I'll even try to find one, because there's definitely going to be that one guy who's going to say, nope, I don't trust you, right? And if we don't have any more questions, I will end it here. It's been 3 hours. If you decide to say at the last moment, I'm gonna ask a question, then go ahead. Like I won't stop you. But if there's no more questions, I will end the lecture here. Thank you all for attending. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for listening to me ramble with my terrible accent. I hope you understood what I was saying, to be honest. And I recorded this. I will publish it on my channel when I am done like editing the stuff in there. Because I want to showcase the sources in the video. So I'll have to do a little bit of editing, but it will be uploaded to my channel. So if you want to watch the lecture in full, it will be there. It will include the Q&A. And that should be it. So again, thank you all for listening. I'll see you guys tomorrow. So be here at 6 p.m. EST tomorrow. This will deal with the theology. So it will be a lot more free-flowing. And there's going to be, I think, a lot more real points that are going to be made. So I'll stop the recording here and